Finally, the Super Bowl has come back!
Warning. A hostile parasite has landed on planet Earth. Seek immediate shelter. Ensure food and water supplies are stocked and ensure your shelter has functioning air filtration units. The military has been deployed, but it is recommended you arm yourselves and prepare for the worst. Do not open your shelter until instructed otherwise. Do not listen to their voices. Do not be afraid. I am peace. I am salvation.
So, on a scale of 1 to Gravemind, how screwed are we in this scenario? Well, allow me to quell or amplify your fears by answering that very question. Many moons ago, I made a video where I tried to simulate as realistically as possible what would happen if the flood came to Earth today, how the world would respond, how the flood would spread through modern means, etc, etc. But today, I want to take a more in-depth look at this scenario and investigate whether hardware used by modern militaries, and in some cases civilians as well, would be sufficient to quell a flood outbreak were it to happen today. So lock your doors, check your air filters, and fuel up those flamethrowers. The flood apocalypse of 2023 has arrived. If a flood outbreak were to occur today, militaries would of course be our first point of defense, and so to understand whether we would actually be able to hold back the parasite today, we need to take a look at the tools that modern militaries would use to combat them. Now, when it comes to a target like the flood, the weapons themselves don't matter quite as much as the type of ammo they fire, within reason. Of course, a flamethrower is always going to be king, but flamethrowers aren't exactly standard issue. Ballistics are, and although the calibers of rounds do vary quite a lot between Western and Eastern militaries, the type of ammunition doesn't tend to. So for Western militaries, standard issue NATO assault rifle ammo is the tried and tested 5.56 by 45mm, and over in the East, militaries nowadays tend to favour the lighter 5.45 by 39mm AK round. Now, both are pretty similar cartridges honestly, and based on my research, the most widely used version of both 5.45 and 5.56 is full metal jacket. And this is the first problem that we run into. FMJ poses quite an issue when it comes to countering the flood, because those rounds have an emphasis on penetration. So if you cast your mind back to Halo 1, you'll remember that the super ultra turbo powerful sniper rifle actually does nothing to the flood. I mean, it barely even scratches them, and the reason for that is because its rounds overpenetrate. Now, granted, the sniper does fire armor-piercing rounds, so yeah, it's a little bit of an extreme example, but when it comes to combating the flood, thanks to their makeup mostly just being rotten biomass, efficiency is all about maximum impact damage over penetration potential. To take down a combat form, hitting specific organs or penetrating highly rated armor isn't really that important. Annihilating its biomass is. And so, when you have an army that are mostly kitted out with rounds specifically designed to penetrate, you start to run into a little bit of a problem. So, moving up the calibers, we have what I'm going to call the battle rifle caliber. These are fairly common rounds that are substantially bigger than 5.56 and 5.45. For Eastern militaries, we have the infamous 7.62 by 39mm round, arguably the most fired ammunition in human history that gained insane popularity with the rise of the AK-47. And then on the Western side, we have the 7.62 by 51mm round, which is commonly referred to as 7.62 NATO. Now, again, based on my research, the most commonly distributed style of both 7.62 Soviet and NATO is once again full metal jacket. Now, granted, their increased size and power does make like 7.62 FMJ much more lethal than 5.56 or 5.45, but still, they're likely to run into the same problems as their smaller cartridges. However, what's interesting is that we actually have a direct point of reference for 7.62 NATO in the Halo universe. The assault rifle fires it. More specifically, the MA5 series of assault rifles tends to fire 7.62 by 51mm FMJ armor-piercing rounds, and despite that, it's a pretty effective weapon against most flood forms, but I think the reason for that is more so because of the sheer number of rounds the AR can dump downrange. I mean, the MA5C kind of, but more specifically, the MA5B of Halo 1 is nothing short of a bullet hose, so regardless of the rounds over-penetrating their infected target, so many bullets are hitting the Flood form, and so much meta-impact damage is being done to their rotting biomass that they can't help but crumble. And you know what? I think modern infantry's greatest chance at beating the Flood would be to employ weapons that work in a similar fashion. Your greatest chance at beating the Flood is by subscribing right now. Look, there's only another 193,214 days until the Flood make landfall on Earth, and trust me when I say that they are going to give you a free pass from infection if you're subscribed to yours truly. Oh, also make sure you follow me on Twitter as well. Sorry, that was the Graveminder speaking, not me. Now, many Western militaries have some sort of 7.62 NATO belt-fed LMG that's distributed as standard in units, from the M240 to the L7A2. And then over in the East, they have a similar sort of arrangement, but with a slightly larger round. 7.62x54 MMR, which is fired by LMGs like the PKP and the PKM. Now, I think with the combination of the size of these rounds and also just the sheer number of them that machine guns are able to dump down range, the rounds themselves having high penetration isn't actually going to be the biggest problem. You know, if a combat form gets hit with 15 of these big-ass rounds all over its body, it's gonna crumble like an old biscuit regardless of the type of rounds hitting it. The problem is though, GPMGs like the M240 and the PKM aren't in the hands of every soldier. They're present, but I don't think they'd be common enough to allow a force to combat a large-scale outbreak like, for example, the one that happened in Voi. That said though, conical bullet-firing weapons aren't the only kinds of weapons that modern militaries use. In fact, there's a type of weapon that is proven to be hyper effective against the Flood that's pretty cheap and rather commonplace among militaries and also civilians: shotguns. Now, we all know how effective Halo's 8-gauge shotgun is against the Flood. I mean, hell, the Flood may as well be allergic to the damn thing, and although standard issue shotguns nowadays aren't quite as powerful as an 8-gauge shotgun, I think they'd still absolutely get the job done. As we know, the name of the game in combating the Flood is impact distribution, hitting as much of their body as possible. Very little can get that done, like good old-fashioned buckshot. 12-gauge 70mm buckshots are thankfully standard issue in both Western and Eastern militaries, and would probably be the most efficient yet accessible cartridge to use against the Flood, and they're also really commonly owned by civilians as well, which would be a great hand if, like in almost every zombie story ever, militaries end up getting overrun. Buckshot is so effective because each shell fires roughly 8+ pellets in a dispersed fashion, which spreads the impact all across the target's body, making it very easy to take down any kind of enemy composed of rather weak, rotting biomass. In Halo, of course, the shotgun has always been the bane of the Flood, and although I do think that effectiveness would transfer over to real life, you do have to bear in mind that Halo's shotgun isn't a typical shotgun. It's 8-gauge, not 12-gauge, and it fires magnum buckshot shells over regular buckshot, so it's definitely a lot more powerful than like a standard issue Earth military shotgun nowadays, but I think that our 12-gauge shotguns would still be really effective against the Parasite. However, buckshot wouldn't be the only efficient shell. As we all know very well, the Flood are highly susceptible to extreme heat and fire. And there's one very iconic shotgun shell that exists in real life today that I think would finally find its hyper niche use case against the Flood: Dragon's Breath. These cartridges fire birdshot pellets, but also ignite shards of magnesium that essentially turn them into incendiary shells with a burn rate of up to 5,000 degrees. If you ask me, that's basically the perfect anti-Flood 12-gauge shell. But as you'd expect, these shells are only really owned by civilians. Militaries aren't outfitted with incendiary shotgun shells for a whole litany of reasons that I don't think I need to go into. Some militaries, however, do still distribute flamethrowers among troops. Now, we all know how effective, or how theoretically effective, the flamethrower should be against the Flood. Halo 3 did not exactly show this off very well, but based on my research, the only major military nowadays to still actively use flamethrowers is the Chinese military. They train with the Type 74 flamethrower, and I don't think I really need to go into much detail as to how effective this thing would be against the Flood. To sum it up very shortly, hot knife, butter. Something that I didn't know until researching for this video, however, is that flamethrowers are, in most places at least, legal to own by civilians, so take that as you will. So, in terms of infantry, both the West and the East best bets would be to make heavy use of shotguns, specifically firing buckshot shells, not slugs, anything that's fire or heat based, and also anything that can dump a large number of rounds downrange as fast as possible. LMGs, GPMGs, and to go a bit of a ridiculous step further, kind of, miniguns would be perfect for this. As important as initial impact damage over penetration is, the biggest factor in putting down almost every Flood form is spreading the damage out across their biomass as much as possible. Weak spots aren't really that important when it comes to fighting the Flood. The quantity of hits matter more than the quality. However, there's something of a secret sauce that we haven't mentioned yet that theoretically would be the absolute perfect type of round to use against the Flood that, as far as I'm aware, has never been used against the Flood in the Halo universe despite that. Hollow points. Hollow point rounds immediately expand upon impact, sacrificing penetration potential for a significantly more lethal initial impact, which is precisely what you need to counter the Flood. Now, here's the interesting thing. Expanding bullets are explicitly banned from combat zones in the real world. However, they are still used by military police and base defense personnel within the US military, and I'd assume that a similar thing is the case for Eastern militaries as well. Further, hollow points are actually a really commonly owned civilian round. There's a lot of them in circulation. So theoretically, if modern research teams realized how effective they are against the Flood, it wouldn't be out of the question for militaries to suddenly start firing it. You know what? I reckon an entire military kitted out with RIP rounds in particular wouldn't have much of an issue quelling at least a smaller scale Flood outbreak. Okay, so everything that we've discussed so far is all well and good, right? But what happens if all initial attempts at containing the outbreak fail and it's left to fester? Well, one of the biggest problems that we're going to be facing is Flood spores contaminating the air, starting in Blightlands, but slowly expanding out as the Flood spread. Now, it goes without saying, but the Flood parasite becoming airborne is a pretty major problem for the civilian population. But the real question is, could modern infantry actually fight in spore-heavy environments where the parasite is airborne? You know what? Honestly, I think they could. Don't get me wrong, extreme decontamination procedures would have to be taken once a mission into a Blightland or a spore-heavy zone is done to ensure that all the spores that are stuck to equipment or clothing are destroyed and aren't brought into safe zones. But I think that modern-day NBC gear and gas masks and the like would actually be more than suitable to combat the Flood. I mean, Flood spores are honestly useless unless they make contact with the skin or are inhaled, which sounds quite hard to avoid, but the spores are actually a lot bigger than you think. I mean, the mere fact that you can actually see Flood spores in the air means that they're more than big enough for gas mask filters to filter out, and I doubt that they'd be able to work their way through any NBC gear and go through it and get on your skin, seeing as, at least as far as we know, spores have no corrosive properties. I actually don't think that Flood spores would really prove much of a threat to modern militaries, of course, if the correct safety precautions were taken. The real problems would stem from if a Blightland or a hive was basically left to spread out of control. If an outbreak gets to the point where an entire city, state, or God forbid, entire country gets consumed, then I don't think hollow points and flamethrowers are really going to cut it anymore. Larger action is definitely needed. I mean, this is the case in the Halo universe, so it's absolutely going to be the case in our world as well. If a modern day outbreak hits this point, if you want even the slightest chance at stopping it from consuming the entire planet, then I think your only course of action is to start using big bombs. Even more so if the Flood evolved from the feral stage to the coordinated stage revolution and, God forbid, start making a Gravemind. Now, obviously, nuclear weapons would be the best bet to use against the Flood. I mean, they're effective against the Flood in Halo, per the Upsilon cryptonym, and so they'd of course be effective against the Flood in our timeline as well. But I like to think of nukes as something of a last resort. I think we all know the destructive capability of modern airstrikes, drone strikes, and artillery, and you know what? For the sake of keeping that monetization icon green, I don't think I'm going to elaborate any further on that. Needless to say, large-scale explosives that are used today would be absolutely effective against the Flood. However, if a Gravemind is formed, then I think the nuclear option is the only option at that point. Trying to attack a Gravemind or a Gravemind in its entire own Blightland through any infantry or ground memes is just ridiculous, and I highly doubt that any military, regardless of how ignorant they are about the Flood compared to, you know, me and you who have been playing Halo for a very long time, would ever consider it over just nuking the area to high hell. Now, clearly, there's something pretty major that we haven't covered yet. Vehicles. It goes without saying that a high explosive tank shell would annihilate any pure form or even proto Gravemind, and I think it also goes without saying that a vehicle mounted Browning 50 cal or 12.7mm DSHK could easily tear through probably hundreds if not thousands of combat forms. It's also a given that modern vehicles, I mean, hell, even vehicles in the Halo universe, are really easy for the Flood to commandeer, either by infecting the crew, or by just piloting them themselves using the knowledge that they've assumed from their infected hosts. Ground vehicles don't really need that much explaining, but air vehicles, see, they're the interesting ones. At face value, it seems like something like like an A-10 Warthog strafe run over a concentrated area of infection, or a Blightland or a Hive would be ultra effective, and yeah, face value it might be, but that doesn't take into consideration the Flood's rarely encountered, yet pretty efficient anti-air capabilities. Infected birds are turned into lethal Flood swarms. Cedar pods act as airborne explosive infection forms that can infect an entire air vehicle and its crew in seconds, and you know, that's not even considering the anti-air weaponry that the Flood combat forms will have scavenged from infected hosts and overrun bases. I think air attacks would be viable outside of a Flood hive when the Flood are, say, moving in large hordes or gathered in an uninfected area, but attacking a hive or a Blightland would be extremely dangerous given the biomass defenses that the Flood can also create in there as well. I mean, large towers like spore mountains that launch projectiles and dense clouds of spores would make mincemeat of any kind of circling helicopter, or hell, even an Osprey, or maybe even like an AC-130 I can see it being pretty effective against as well. And they'd make any kind of air-based infiltration of ground troops almost impossible. I mean, helicopters are practically sitting ducks when they're dropping troops off, and troops descending via parachute? I mean, are you crazy? That's about as effective as injecting yourself with Flood supercells. It just makes me even more adamant that any kind of ground assault into a Blightland or a hive nowadays would just be a complete fool's errand. I mean, at that point, if there's a Blightland or a hive formed, I think the nuclear option is the only option. So, the bottom line. Would modern military and civilian gear be able to quell a Flood outbreak if one occurred today? Well, let's summarize. A large majority of standard issue military ammo in both the East and the West would be mostly ineffective against most Flood forms thanks to its focus on penetration over initial impact damage. That said though, despite also having too heavy an emphasis on penetration, higher caliber rounds like 7.62 NATO for example would be effective against the Flood when fired in large numbers thanks to their raw power. Remember, the name of the game with the Flood is sheer force, which those heavier rounds absolutely have regardless of penetration value. Modern day shotgun shells, in particular buckshot and dragon's breath, would be pretty effective for the same reason that they are in Halo, and luckily for us, the former, at least, are highly abundant and could be distributed among militaries and civilians with relative ease. Hollow points and hollow point derivatives like rip rounds would be the most effective modern conical bullet against most regular Flood forms thanks to their emphasis on initial impact over penetration. Modern NBC clothing and protection would, I think, be surprisingly effective at preventing infection via spores should the Flood go airborne. The mounted 50 cal GPMGs on Humvees and LAVs, and of course the main cannons on tanks, would be highly lethal against even the bigger Flood forms like tanks, juggernauts and proto Gravemind. But the vehicles and their crews, however, would be highly susceptible to flood infection, just as they are in Halo. Strafers with aircraft like the A-10 Warthog would be really effective outside of hives, but within hives and Blightlands, they'd be far too risky thanks to the Flood's anti-air defenses and infection capabilities. Modern payloads and weapons of mass destruction would be extremely lethal against large Flood hordes, formations, hives, and Blightlands. Overall, the best chance that we'd have at quelling an outbreak would be catching it as early as possible, ideally while it's still in the feral stage of evolution and has no central intelligence guiding it. If containment teams were sent into Ground Zero fast, then I think that we would have a chance at stamping out the infection, but should that fail, and the Flood begin transforming an area into a Blightland or a hive, well, carpet bombs or napalm would also, I think, be an extremely effective modern counter. But should that fail, and the Flood advance to the coordinator stage and form a Gravemind, well, at that point, nukes really would be our only option. Honestly, when you weigh it all up, I actually do think that modern equipment and weaponry would be effective enough at countering the Flood to contain an outbreak. The only problem is that a lot of what is effective, at least in terms of small arms specifically, isn't exactly standard military issue. With the exception of buckshot, incendiary shells, flamethrowers, and hollow points are rare, if not non-existent within militaries. At least officially. And although they could be distributed among ground forces, how quickly that could actually be done would be the real deciding factor. If entire ground forces were kitted out with rip rounds, flamethrowers, and incendiary munitions, well, I actually think they might have a chance at turning the tide on an outbreak quite early. However, if they're sent in with 5.56 and 5.45 FMJ, well...
Gonna have a bad time.
Now, tell me in the comments, and I want you to be honest here, do you honestly think that you could survive a Flood outbreak? You know, I'd hazard a guess that us guys and girls are probably the most Flood-informed people on the planet, so at the very least, we've got that going for us. Gazing up at the stars in the night sky is one of the greatest sources of wonder and amazement. But beyond those stars, in the intense blackness beyond our galaxy, lies a horror too distant for our telescopes to see, but it can see us. A parasite that watches us through the intergalactic void like a window in the night, knowing at any moment it can break the glass and come in. But it doesn't. Not yet. In over 100,000 years since its creation, the Flood has spread far and wide across the galaxy, consuming flesh and biomass in the trillions. But what if it spread outside of our galaxy? What if there are galaxies out there beyond the Milky Way that have been entirely consumed by Flood? Well, there's actually a lot of evidence that suggests that hypothetical may just be true. In fact, our Milky Way may be one of the only galaxies not consumed by the Flood. Today, we investigate whether the Flood's insatiable hunger has caused it to infect other galaxies. So, to understand this deeply cosmic horror, we need to go through how the Flood evolved from a simple parasite to a species that are capable of traversing galaxies. And so, this video is going to kind of double up as a breakdown of the Flood's horrifying evolution as well. A Flood outbreak begins in the feral stage of evolution. This is the stage that we saw during the outbreak on Alpha Halo in Halo 1. Now, as the name implies, the Flood in this stage are, well, feral and uncoordinated, with no central intelligence to guide them or offer any kind of robust leadership. Besides the anomaly of the Juggernaut, they're guided simply by instinct alone. Instinct that drives them to infect and consume as much as possible. Despite their relative lack of direction in this stage, and also the fact that their hordes are limited to only infection forms, carrier forms, and combat forms, the Flood are still extremely dangerous. They move in hordes, overwhelming their victims with sheer numbers and brute force, all in the vein of gathering biomass, which is their main priority in this stage, which allows them to construct a proto-gravemind. Over time, this proto-gravemind grows thanks to the continual infection of biomass before ultimately becoming a full-blown gravemind, transitioning the Flood into the second stage of evolution, the coordinator stage. This is the stage that the Flood outbreak was in Halo 2 and Halo 3. With the dawn of the coordinator stage, the Flood becomes significantly more dangerous because now they're led by a hyper-intelligent compound mind that makes them act like a hive mind. They also gain the ability to create Flood forms from scratch. pure forms. This means that they no longer have to infect a healthy host to bolster their numbers, they can just do it organically, but that doesn't mean that they still don't want to infect. Infection is still a big priority in this stage. It's in this stage where the outbreak really starts to spiral out of control because hives begin to be constructed. Now, flood hives act primarily as a means of creating a perfectly controlled localized environment to facilitate the flood's growth and expansion, which is achieved by sustaining warm, humid temperatures and also secreting flood spores into the air, which makes breathing in the vicinity of a hive an almost guaranteed infection. Hives also act as a kind of flood base as well, and are likely to be the #1 target of an opposing force, but their primary goal is to create the perfect environment for flood growth. In this coordinator stage, many of the pure forms created are what's known as key minds, forms that provide local leadership and direction to other infected in highly specialized and unique manners. For example, the Helion guides sieging, whereas the Abomination just guides large hordes in general. As a part of this stage, the Flood's priorities shift from simple infection to the consumption of neural tissue and biomass, seeking to not only grow their numbers but also grow their intelligence, their knowledge, and their wisdom. The Gravemind is able to infect AIs, data networks, and even biologicals with the Logic Plague, compromising its foes' greatest informational repositories and even leaders, allowing it to gain enough intelligence to reach the third stage of evolution, the interstellar stage. Once the Gravemind has been fully established, hives, spore mountains, and other structures and defenses fully constructed, the Flood's infinite hunger compels it to spread beyond its localized Blightland by leveraging any technology and knowledge available to search for others to infect. Now, as the name implies, this often entails spreading to entirely different star systems, which is now possible thanks to the knowledge that it consumed during the coordinator stage about its enemy's starships and their means of FTL travel. When starships are commandeered by the Flood, they turn them into plague ships, reinforcing them with biomass and Flood supercell growths that convert them into mobile hives, used for spreading the infection and even kamikazeing down to uninfected planets to begin an outbreak. At this point, the Flood is spreading across the galaxy at an almost untrackable state. Any hope to contain this outbreak is no more. Any colony, no matter how distant or quiet, is vulnerable to infection. Entire regions of space fall victim to the parasite, regions the foreigners refer to as burns. These galactic quarantine zones are deemed entirely unrecoverable and are subject to total sterilization, rendering any world within uninhabitable. The Gravemind doesn't even necessarily require FTL-capable ships to go through subspace. Thanks to its depthless well of knowledge, spanning tens of millions of years of technological advancements from species that are far more advanced than anything that exists nowadays, it can harness the power of precursor neural physics to travel through subspace without an FTL drive, as it did to get to the Ark in Halo 3. This knowledge of the precursors also allows the Flood in the interstellar stage to begin harnessing the power of their constructs, notably star roads. Ancient, esoteric precursor structures that act as pathways woven between dimensions, built with esoteric matter and neural physical links. Now, if that makes no sense whatsoever, it's kinda not supposed to. Any precursor tech isn't supposed to be comprehensible by us, that's by design. These star roads offered the Flood secret passageways through the galaxy, and were also used to physically destroy the Greater Ark towards the end of the war. Beyond the interstellar stage, there's a terrifyingly mysterious stage of evolution, one that merely exists in the final hushed whispers of dying ancients. The transgalactic stage. The transgalactic stage of Flood evolution is achieved once they've infected all star systems in a galaxy. That means that every single biological sentient being in an entire galaxy has been infected, consumed, and assimilated into the hive mind. And so too have all non-biological entities, sentients like AIs and non-sentients like computer systems, networks, and other such things. This is a total galactic apocalypse, an apocalypse in which nothing survives. The Flood now possess the knowledge and biomass of an entire galaxy, but with that have achieved critical mass, and so their next goal is to spread to neighbouring galaxies to continue consuming, and thanks to their vast knowledge, this is possible. From here, nobody's even left alive to document the next steps of Flood evolution, but theoretically, the cycle of feral to coordinated to interstellar to transgalactic would just repeat in galaxies until eventually the flood reached, and again, this is just my own theoretical headcanon, the trans-universe stage when all galaxies in a universe had been consumed and they gained the ability to jump to entirely separate universes, but my god, that is a horror that I don't even want to contemplate. You know, it's safe to say that if a flood outbreak reaches the point where it's spread so far and wide, it can literally hop universes. None of us are even going to be here to contemplate it, so for better or worse, that's a thought that we don't even need to have. And so that brings us to the other part of this video. There is significant evidence to suggest that the flood, during and actually even before the Foreigner Flood War, could have very likely reached this transgalactic stage and spread beyond the Milky Way galaxy. That means that the flood have potentially spread beyond the effective range of the halos. Now, that should scream something quite obvious, but if it's not screaming it, then let me just say it in plain words for you. That means that right now, as of the 2560s, or, you know, if you want to really put the tinfoil hat on and say that our universe is the same as Halo's universe, the 2020s, there are entire galaxies out there somewhere infected by the flood. Again, theoretically, in the background of the events of Infinite, up there in the sky, the flood are spreading from galaxy to galaxy. And you know, if you do choose to believe this, and trust me if you don't, I'm going to try and convince you in a second, you could also make the logical assumption that there is a chance that a higher percentage of the universe is infected by the flood than not infected. But that's a source of cosmic horror that is very, very, very hypothetical and not canon, at least as far as we know, by any means. But anyway, let's get to the evidence. The first of which is courtesy of Guilty Spark.
Oh, hello.
So, in one of the Halo 1 anniversary terminals, Spark says that he has no reason to believe the entirety of the flood are in our galaxy. More may be waiting in the frozen void beyond our galaxy.
Of course, I have no reason to believe that here lies the entirety of the parasite. It may be waiting in the frozen void beyond this galaxy, or worse, inexorably drifting toward us.
Now granted, at this point, Spark was in the throes of loneliness-induced rampancy, so take this with a grain of salt, but the mere fact that a monitor even thought to speculate about the flood existing in other galaxies is kinda telling to me. But the most glaring evidence comes straight from the horse's mouth. In Halo Silentium, the Gravemind declares it has consumed 10,000 planets and brought entire galaxies to an end, which obviously implies that either during or before the Foreigner Flood War, the flood had reached the transgalactic stage and had infected other galaxies. But again, there is a caveat to this quote. The way this information was delivered was essentially propaganda. It was said in the final hours of the war when the Librarian was stranded on Earth, and the Gravemind sends the essences of ancient human warriors inhabiting the bodies of rotting, infected composer victims to essentially torment the Librarian, revealing the true precursor nature of the domain and other such things. Now, granted, it wasn't lying about the domain is a precursor entity, so it wasn't wrong about everything, but like I said, it's kind of propaganda, kind of flood propaganda, so do take it with a little pinch of salt. Now, what isn't as subjective though is the stage of evolution that the flood reached during the scarcely documented human flood war that preceded the Foreigner Flood War. When the flood first emerged in the Halo universe, it ran rampant throughout human regions of the Milky Way, so much so that the humans were forced to retreat into Foreigner-controlled space. Entire colonies and star systems that were once human-controlled were infected, which confirms that the flood, at the time, had reached the interstellar stage. However, when the Foreigners exterminated and devolved the humans for at least what they thought was an invasion of their territory, the flood chose to recede and didn't continue their spread into Foreigner space. Now, the reason for this wasn't because they couldn't spread into Foreigner-controlled space, but rather because they chose not to. Their retreat was part of a larger, wider strategy, a greater plan to bring about immense pain and, through that pain, great unity, which they eventually achieved when they returned 10,000 years later. However, the Flood's choice to voluntarily retreat implies that they did have the capabilities to spread to Foreigner systems, and thus, other star systems as well. And so, in those 10,000 years where the Foreigners believed the Flood had been defeated or died off, I think there's a pretty high chance that they spread to other systems as well. I mean, what else do you think they did during that massive gap of time? Just like hang around? Wait? I doubt the flood just chilled for 10,000 years. That's not really their prerogative. Even if during their initial spread through human space they didn't reach the transgalactic stage, which honestly I don't think they did at that point, that still doesn't rule out the flood spreading to other galaxies to increase their infected numbers. After all, the transition from interstellar to transgalactic is done out of pure necessity, not because one specific piece of technology is discovered or a specific flood form is created, like the transition from feral to coordinated requiring a gravemind. There's none of that. It's pure necessity. It's done because they've consumed everything in the current galaxy and can only continue to consume by moving on to a different one, and so I don't think it's out of the equation for the flood to have spread to nearby dwarf galaxies in between humanity's defeat and the Foreigner Flood War. I mean, human-controlled space was right on the edge of the Milky Way, so much so that only one hemisphere of their capital world, Charum Hakor, had stars in its night sky. So out of anywhere in the galaxy, this was arguably the closest to other galaxies, and it just so happened to be infected. The flood spreading to other galaxies during this time as well just perfectly lines up with not just their need to constantly consume, but also their need to bring unity. They intentionally retreated from the Foreigners, likely to instill a false sense of security, but they still would have wanted to consume. That wouldn't have just gone away, and so traveling to nearby galaxies using highly advanced ancient human technology and infecting those galaxies and consuming them would line up well. The only external galaxy that we know isn't infected, or at least wasn't infected as of the end of the Foreigner Flood War, there's nothing to say that flood from other galaxies haven't come to it since, is Path Chthona, or the Large Magellanic Cloud as it was called, which was where Faber test-fired Omega Halo. Obviously, firing a halo in the galaxy is going to do a lot of damage to any flood there, so as of the end of the Foreigner Flood War, there's no flood there, but like I said, who's to say that more flood didn't come in from other galaxies? Never know. But the big question at this point is, if there are other galaxies out there entirely infected by the flood, why haven't they come to our galaxy yet? Well, I think the most likely answer is the same reason that they left the Foreigners alone for 10,000 years. It's part of some greater plan, which the Primordial declared to the Isodidact moments before being turned to dust. It was long ago decided. Foreigners will never bear the mantle. The decision is final. Humans will replace you. Humans will be tested next. It is the way of those who seek out the truth of the mantle. Humans will rise. Whether they will also fail has not yet been decided. The Precursor's final test for the mantle. Now, this is something that I've been talking about for 8 years now. Jesus Christ, 8 years, that's a long time. Basically, what this final test is it was a plot device that was set up in Halo Primordium in 2012 that, should this device ever be used in a story, should theoretically mark the ultimate return of the Flood. And what better way for that to happen than for literal entire galaxies of Flood to descend upon humanity. The whole point of this test is to test humanity at their absolute peak. To see if, at their strongest, at their ripest, they're powerful, intelligent, and caring enough to be able to uphold the mantle of responsibility, protecting all of the species in the galaxy from the ultimate threat. Not to go full Mob of the Dead on you or anything, but I've been convinced now, for like the better part of the last decade, that Halo's universe is stuck in a cycle perpetuated by the Precursors and the Flood, and that to break that cycle means that a species have successfully passed the test and are fit to hold the mantle. The cycle begins with the Precursors seeding a galaxy, as they have done countless times in the billion years of their existence, with the hopes that one of their creations that they're seeding will be fit to hold the mantle one day. They then let the species evolve and advance, and when the Precursors deem them ripe, they inflict the test with the Flood. If the species win and defeat the Flood, they're proven fit to hold the mantle. If they lose, the entire galaxy is infected, and then the cycle repeats, just in a different galaxy with a different species. Humanity and our galaxy just happen to be the next repetition of the cycle. If we fail the test, then our galaxy, the Milky Way, is overwhelmed with Flood and the cycle repeats in another galaxy. But if that's the case, and there are other galaxies out there that have failed to break the cycle and thus are entirely infected with Flood, why haven't the powers that be sent those Flood to our galaxy to test us yet? Well, the Primordial emphasizes that the Flood will return when humanity are ripe. Now, yes, you could make the argument that this could be referring to any of the outbreaks during the original Halo trilogy, but I think to say that humanity were ripe for testing during the Halo trilogy, during the Human Covenant War, would be kind of false. We were on the back foot getting our asses kicked that entire war, and we are right now as well. Ripeness to me implies that humanity are the dominant force in the galaxy, but not in an oppressive way, rather in a caring way, which is what the mantle enforces, and we'll only be in that state once every current major threat is eliminated. Cycles, infinite loops, and ancient conspiracy theories aside though, the mere thought that there genuinely could be other galaxies out there in the sky beyond our reach festering with Flood is a truly terrifying thought. It really encapsulates the kind of cosmic horror and also fear of the unknown that the Flood are so effective at inducing. The existence of a Gravemind is a terrifying discovery for a civilization to make. In the entire history of the Halo universe, there have only ever been 2 Flood outbreaks that were able to consume enough biomass to establish a Gravemind, and both those outbreaks came horrifyingly close to consuming the entire galaxy. However, despite this, the true horror of a Gravemind transcends far beyond anything the games and even most Halo media dare go into. But today, we venture into that terrifying beyond. It's time to expose the terrifying reality of the Gravemind. Now, for all the deep hidden horror of the Gravemind, there are some traits that tend to get glossed over because, well, frankly, they're so obvious that you don't even think about them. Firstly, its size. Now, we've never actually seen what a Gravemind looks like in full from head to toe, or whatever the hell the Gravemind equivalent of head to toe is, but fear not, I've done some very, very rough calculations to try and figure out its rough size. So, I used this frame here of Chief and Arbiter first meeting the Gravemind in Halo 2, and I measured the Gravemind in Master Chiefs. No, I'm not kidding. So, the Gravemind is 23 7'2" Master Chiefs tall. So, 23 times 7'2" is 165 feet. That means that the Gravemind, when coiled up like this, is 165 feet tall, which is just under half the length of a football field. But bear in mind that that is a highly reserved estimate as well. I mean, if the Gravemind elongated its neck, I guarantee it'd be at least double in size, if not more. And that's just the neck. I mean, there's so much more to a Gravemind than just a neck, a head, and a mound of biomass. Literally every piece of concept art that we have alludes to this only being the top of the form. And then there's also the fact that nowadays the term Gravemind isn't even limited to, well, this. Graveminds can be so large now that they consume entire planets. So you can't even provide like a rough average size, considering that a Gravemind could, hypothetically, just keep growing forever. Something equally as terrifying that comes as a byproduct of its size is its strength. The extended tentacles of the Gravemind, and hell, even the smaller ones, are extremely powerful. The smaller ones can lift Master Chief, a half-ton super soldier, like he's a 1 pound weight, and the bigger ones have enough force to make an entire Foreigner Citadel shake, and also to hold back a Pelican that's fully engaging its thrusters. Now, if the highly advanced Proto-Gravemind's tentacles in Halo Wars 2 are anything to go by, the tentacles are extremely tough as well. I mean, in Halo Wars 2, these things seemed almost impenetrable, and they weren't even created by a full Gravemind, just a Proto-Gravemind, so it's safe to say that it has resilience to back up its strength. But I mean, the most obvious source of horror here is just what a Gravemind actually is. I mean, it's a gigantic, tentacled beast that's made from the consumed, recycled, rotting biomass of humans, elites, brutes, grunts, drones, plants, anything organic the Flood can get its hands and tentacles on in its most primitive state. On its most surface level, the Gravemind is a truly horrifying entity. But come on, we knew that already, right? I mean, so far we've just pointed out the obvious, and yeah, you're right. it's time to delve a little bit deeper. But trust me, before we do, you're going to want to make sure that you're subscribed and follow me on Twitter. The depths that we're about to plunge into are going to get pretty nasty, and you're going to want to make sure that you've got a flood aficionado on your side to keep you safe. And well, I am that guy. What the existence of a Gravemind indicates about the wider flood outbreak is enough to strike fear into the heart of even the most stalwart individual. If a Gravemind merely exists, then the flood outbreak is no longer confined to a small area. The sheer size of a Gravemind necessitates a ton, in fact, probably thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of tons of raw biomass. Entire local ecosystems have to be consumed, including living sentient beings, plants, and vegetation. And so the existence of a Gravemind not only means that once luscious, thriving ecosystems have been defiled into rotting blightlands, but it's a terrifying confirmation that the outbreak is no longer small in scale. In fact, it's quite the opposite. And in keeping with this, the Gravemind's existence also means that the flood have evolved. No longer are they restrained by the primitive shackles of the feral stage of evolution that an outbreak begins in. The flood have now advanced onward to the coordinator stage. Marking the second known stage of the flood's evolutionary trail, the coordinator stage of evolution brings with it some horrifying traits. The flood infection has spread wide enough to allow the supercell to create hives and secrete spores into the air, which makes the flood airborne. It also no longer requires hosts to add to its infected numbers. Supercells can be generated out of seemingly nowhere to create highly specialized and lethal pure forms. And because of the amount of biomass consumed, local environments have been turned into blightlands. Highly dangerous, impassable regions consumed entirely by the parasite, modified by the supercell to create the perfect environment to facilitate further flood growths. Structures like the hive and defenses should anyone dare to launch a full-scale assault on their now parasite-ridden soil. Should any fool attempt such a perilous act, ravenous blightstalker pure forms that patrol the wastes of the Blightland will hunt any uninfected host to further add to the outbreak's biomass. But worst of all, reaching the coordinator stage now means that the flood have a leader. As the name implies, the fighting flood forms, so the infection forms, the carrier forms, the combat forms, etc., are relatively feral and unguided in the feral stage. But with the dawn of the coordinator stage, they're all connected to the hive mind of the Gravemind, who, with exceptional intelligence, is able to command them in battle, using unparalleled strategy and planning to overcome even the most prepared forces. And that, to me, is the ultimate terrifying reality of the Gravemind. Not its size or its appearance, but rather its intelligence and the byproducts of that. The Gravemind's battlefield effectiveness, both in physical and psychological warfare, is immense, absolutely bar none. Not only is it intelligent enough to command seemingly infinite numbers of infantry, vehicles, and fleets of ships, but it can speak through combat forms to intimidate and terrify its enemies on the field, and even form reactionary alliances with its enemies should the need arise, as we saw in Halo 2 and Halo 3. You've got to remember, a Gravemind's ultimate goal, and by extension the Flood's ultimate goal as well, is total galactic consumption, and it's willing and smart enough to do anything it needs to achieve that goal. But its intelligence goes far beyond just battlefield effectiveness. Because of what the source of the Gravemind's intelligence actually is, it's privy to some of the deepest and most esoteric information in the history of not just the galaxy, but likely the universe as well. See, the Gravemind's knowledge and personality don't just come into creation when it's formed. They're in fact those of the primordial, the last precursor, and the first Gravemind. Now, the precursors are the gods of creation in the Halo universe. They were hyper-advanced, eldritch-like beings that existed tens, if not hundreds of millions of years ago, and were responsible for the creation of all life in the galaxy, from humanity to the prophets, the foreigners, and beyond. Their existence is complicated and very, very difficult to comprehend, but one of their main beliefs was a philosophical concept known as neural physics, which basically means that everything in existence, and I mean literally everything from us to planets to stars to the phone or TV that you're watching this video on, are all living entities. Now, that makes absolutely no sense, and it's not supposed to. You see, the Precursor's intelligence was so far beyond the comprehension of even the most intelligent beings in the galaxy that nobody can truly grasp how any of their concepts really work. All we know is that those concepts are actually in existence, they're real, and using these concepts, when the Primordial was killed some 100,000 years ago, its consciousness survived the destruction of its mortal body by being woven into the fabric of existence, per neural physics, only to inhabit a grave mind upon its creation and become its consciousness. So, to cut a very long story short, the Gravemind's personality and intelligence are the very same ones that the Primordial held, which in turn means that the Gravemind possesses all the knowledge that the Primordial held as well. And given what I've just described, I don't think I need to elaborate on how truly terrifying that thought is. It's a kind of terror that goes far beyond something just being frightening to experience. I mean, this thing possesses knowledge that would quite literally undo all of humanity's understanding of history, of our creation, of religion, and of the galaxy itself. The foundations of everything that we believe to be true wouldn't just be shook, they'd be shattered. The psychological torment that a Gravemind could very easily inflict on a populace far surpasses anything that humanity or any other species has ever encountered before. But to bring it all back down to the terror of the Flood itself, because the parasite was able to so easily overwhelm both ancient humanity and the Foreigners all those millennia ago, that means that the Gravemind also possesses intimate knowledge of how to outsmart and annihilate races that are infinitely more advanced than Halo's humanity. It's privy to all the tactics and strategy that it employed to annihilate the two most technologically advanced races in galactic history. Nothing that currently exists in the Halo universe could, at least theoretically, outsmart a Gravemind on the battlefield. And you know what? Even if it could, it'd still be susceptible to infection. The Gravemind also has intimate knowledge of ships of all kinds, from ancient, long-dormant Foreigner vessels to modern-day UNSC, Covenant or Banner ships, and so, by extension, also has intimate knowledge of slipspace travel. In fact, its knowledge of FTL travel far outmatches anything in the current Halo universe. In Halo 3, it was able to use High Charity to jump from Mars to the Ark right on the outer rim of the galaxy without the need for a dedicated portal to the installation like the one that we had to use. With this knowledge, as soon as the Gravemind infects literally just one ship, the Flood outbreak becomes impossible to track. Calling it galactic whack-a-mole frames it quite lightly, but the Gravemind could literally just infect a bunch of ships and send them all off to like the distant dark corners of the universe to infect distant planets, and as it did during its war with the Foreigners, consume the galaxy slowly and quietly from the outside in. This makes it even easier for the Flood to consume more biomass and eventually assimilate enough knowledge from its victims to evolve into its fourth and final stage of evolution, the transgalactic stage, where the Gravemind and its infected gain the ability to spread to different galaxies. During the Foreigner Flood War, it was heavily believed that the Gravemind had actually reached this stage and had consumed tens of thousands of planets in countless different galaxies. Now, if that is true, granted it was just a theory from the Librarian, but if the Librarian was right in that assumption, those galaxies are likely still infected now, because the Halos can't reach them. But you know what? Talking about different galaxies out there that may be entirely consumed by the Flood might be a different topic for a different day. But biological infection isn't the only thing the Gravemind is capable of orchestrating. Hands down to me, the single most terrifying aspect of the Gravemind's intelligence is its ability to transpose that infection over to the digital realm, courtesy of the Logic Plague. Now, the Logic Plague is going to be getting its own dedicated video soon, so firstly, make sure you sub so you don't miss that, and secondly, that means that I'm just going to sum it up shortly here. Basically, if you don't know, the Logic Plague is the digital informational version of Flood infection. As soon as a Gravemind is formed, nothing is uncompromisable anymore. AIs that control flagships, coordinate strike missions, and maintain the entire infrastructure of the UNSC, computer systems and networks that form the entire backbone of 26th century humanity, all are susceptible to infection. Typically, the Logic Plague has to be transmitted personally, directly by the Gravemind, as was the case with Mendicant Bias, the most infamous case of Logic Plague. But if the outbreak has progressed too far, like it did during the Foreigner Flood War, then literally any flood form gains the ability to transmit it. That means that a combat form merely being in the vicinity of an AI or computer network is enough for that entire entity to be infected, to fall into rampancy, and to be assimilated into the Flood's vast hive mind of intelligence. But somehow, it gets worse. The Logic Plague doesn't just stop at digital entities. A Gravemind can choose to infect a biological host with the Logic Plague over regular physical infection. Now, this has only ever been known to have happened once with the Didact, and it has some pretty extreme situational benefits. To infect a biological entity with the Logic Plague, the Gravemind essentially talks to it, divulging horrifying realities about the true nature of the Flood and other such things in a bet to essentially tear its victim's sanity apart, causing chaos and demoralization in its enemy's forces when their leader appears to have, for all intents and purposes, gone insane. Honestly, the Gravemind's psychological warfare capabilities are even more terrifying than its physical warfare capabilities. Think about how cataclysmic this becomes when later down the line, any flood form can transmit the Logic Plague. Say, hypothetically, an infected ship full of combat forms were to land on a fresh, uninfected planet. Their mere presence in a town or a city would be more than enough to make their enemy yield. Every AI, network, and system that the combat forms come into contact with would be corrupted and controlled by the hive mind, and all the civilians and soldiers that are stationed there to defend the planet would be sent insane for merely being in the presence of the infected. And then, later on, once their insanities run its course, they'd just be used as biomass. The Flood may well be the single most overpowered parasite in the entirety of sci-fi, if you ask me, and honestly, I pin that down to the Gravemind's intelligence. In the chilling words of a Foreigner AI present in the final days of the Foreigner Flood War, the Flood is no idiot parasite. And that to me is the terrifying reality of the Flood, but primarily of the Gravemind. As energetic and tenacious as life is, it has an antithesis just as powerful, something the Foreigners conjured up 1,000 failed plans to try and overcome: the Flood. In the end, they were forced to fall back on the Halos to vanquish the parasite, but for thousands of years prior, rumours had spread among the Ecumene of another solution. One it was believed ancient humanity had used to defeat the Flood during their initial outbreak: a cure. In pursuit of this vital asset, the Foreigners conducted some of the most horrific and disturbing experiments in all of Halo lore to try and extract the knowledge that they believed their rivals had once discovered. But what was this cure? How did it work? How was it used? Did it even exist? Today we answer all of that and more by diving into the mystery of the Flood Cure. So, to understand the existence of the Flood Cure, we have to go back to its supposed origin, to where it was first believed to have been used. Centuries before the Foreigners first encountered the Flood, the ancient humans fought a long and oddly successful war with the parasite. The initial outbreak began when mysterious derelict ships landed on ancient human colonies, filled with vials of a desiccated powder. After great investigation, scientists found nothing harmful about this powder, and so it was fed to a dog-like species known as the Faru, thanks to its ability to elicit positive behavioural and physical mutations. But over time, these Faru began cannibalizing one another, growing infested tendrils and secreting spores that spread the very same infection to their masters. This was the genesis of the Flood. This virus spread rapidly throughout the human population, causing them to retreat into Foreigner-controlled space, an act of war. Weakened from fighting on two fronts, the Foreigners initially crushed any human attempts to seize their colony worlds, but after a while, the humans' weakness seemed to fade. it was almost as if they began surging back, as if they were now only fighting the war on one front. On distant expeditions, foreigner fleets came across entirely healthy human populations residing in completely flood-infested sectors of the galaxy, unharmed and seemingly unbothered. And so, the foreigners' immediate belief was that their mortal enemies had found a way to overcome the flood via immunization, developing a natural resistance, or possibly even by discovering a cure. Unfortunately, despite this apparent revelation, the humans had simply suffered far too many losses at the hands of the foreigners, and so they were still fighting a losing war. As the Didact, who was the leader of the foreigner military at the time, advanced his fleets into human-controlled space, he noted that it seemed as though the Flood no longer had any interest in infecting humans, despite the fact that it still held dominion over thousands of worlds along the galactic margins. It hadn't vanished, it was clearly still a threat, clearly still spreading as aggressively as ever, and yet the humans seemed immune to it. As the foreigners closed in on the last of the human remnants in their own region of the galaxy, they also destroyed any trace of the flood they found, and for a time, it seemed as though the parasite had been defeated. Despite the fact that calculations done by the Lifeworkers suggested that at its current rate of virulence, the flood would consume the entire galaxy in a mere few hundred years, as the humans were defeated, the flood seemed to almost just be vanishing. Almost in a deliberate form of retreat, which led to some within the Ecumene starting to believe that humanity had even established a pact with the parasite to share in their defeat should the time come. Despite being on the cusp of victory, complacency was the last thing on the foreigners' minds. They were far from an ignorant species. They'd witnessed the flood firsthand, and unless they could confirm it with their own eyes, they weren't willing to accept that the parasite was gone forever. In fact, it was the majority opinion across the Ecumene, across every rate, that the flood's return was inevitable. With the foreigners all but convinced that the flood's return was an inevitability, the following years were taken up by extensive research into immunity. Any captured human warriors, when questioned, refused to divulge any information about their supposed cure, and analysis of dead humans yielded no answers. But still, the Council of the Ecumene were adamant that a vaccine or a cure existed. And so, flood research facilities were constructed on installations all across the galaxy, where the Lifeworkers, under the command of the Librarian, would conduct extensive research into the parasite to try and discover said vaccine or cure. In her pursuit of these things, all attempts at finding answers within human genetics or memory proved fruitless, and so the Librarian believed that the answer instead lay in the remaining intact human populations. She believed that by studying the subtle discourse of the species, their culture, their language, their population-wide exchanges, a cure would surely be discovered if one existed. So she pleaded with the Council not to eradicate the rest of humanity. But they didn't follow her wishes. In the end, however, she did manage to strike a deal with the Builders, the creators of the Halos, to establish programs of relentless research into the Flood cure, which did eventually sway the Council into a bargain. At this point in the galaxy, the Builder rate had a lot of swaying power. Humanity would not be eradicated, but rather reset, sent back to the Stone Age to act as a mockery of their former selves, and the Lifeworkers would be commanded to use any means necessary to discover the human secret to flood resistance. However, these commands would quickly spiral out of control as the flood's consumption began to spell doom. After much study into these early human populations, to no avail, the Librarian led a research mission into the satellite galaxy of Pathcathona, believed by some to have been the origin of the flood. But what she found there would shatter her belief in her own species. A small community of very old foreigners, pre-industrial and primitive, who were found surviving on a random colony. It turned out that these were the warrior servants who millions of years prior had exterminated the precursors, but had such shame for their actions that they chose to live out the rest of their days in almost a self-imposed exile. When these warrior servants were genociding the precursors, some of the precursors had turned themselves into a dust, a desiccated powder, the same powder that created the flood. And so, in a sick and bitter way, the Librarian had in fact discovered the flood's origins, but yet still, there was no cure to be found. The librarian wasn't the only one searching for a cure, however. There were other foreigners, and some of them took more disturbing routes, shall we say, to discover said cure. Faber, the master builder and the leader of the Builder Rate, was one such foreigner. Faber had a more brute force method of approaching its discovery, with little regard for the sanctity and well-being of the humans. When ancient humanity were reset, personality imprints of their former advanced selves were placed within many of the humans that the librarian reseeded on planet Earth, but Faber believed that this population was the answer to the cure. Against the wishes of the Council and the Librarian, he ordered that many of these humans be transported from Earth to Zeta Halo, where cruel experiments would be conducted in flood research facilities that humans on the Ring called the Palace of Pain. Within these research facilities, the humans' imprints were forcibly and excruciatingly removed by a composer, so researchers could sift through them and interrogate them for any knowledge of a cure. A plan that, yet again, bore no fruit. Few who were taken to the Palace of Pain ever returned, but those who did came back wrong, twisted and sick, a shadow of their former selves, haunted by what Faber had done to them. He also tried to use the composer to extract the soul out of a combat form from its former host and plant that soul, that essence, in a new and infected body. However, this too failed. Somehow, the parasite would follow the soul to its new body and eventually infect it as well. Later, after all of these experiments had failed, Faber traveled to the homeworld of the ancient prophets, Janjaquam. The prophets had been humanity's closest allies, if you can believe it, and among the few who still remained was one who was extremely close to the Didact, known as the First Prophet, who apparently knew of humanity's cure and promised the Didact that should the parasite ever return, he would reveal it. However, there was a problem. So, days prior to Faber's arrival at Janjaquam, the librarian had gone to the civilization to index them should the flood arrive on their world and eradicate them. But her arrival had sparked unrest and, ultimately, a rebellion, and when Faber arrived, he unknowingly killed the First Prophet, sending him and all of his knowledge to the grave. Faber's insanity, sparked by the Gravemind torturing him with memories of his flood-infected wives and children, ultimately led to his demise when the flood assaulted the Greater Ark at the end of the war. He went out still none the wiser about the cure. And then there was the Didact, who believed that he had, in his own way, created a cure that was different to what the humans had supposedly created themselves. Using the composer, digitizing the essence of biologicals, he believed that they became impossible to infect, in turn becoming the perfect anti-flood warrior. This was the genesis of the Prometheans. However, this plan was unfortunately enacted far too late in the war, and there just weren't enough composer victims left to make a difference. As far as we know, the Prometheans couldn't be infected, at least ordinarily, by the flood, but they could still be destroyed, and so this too was yet another attempt at a cure that failed. So every attempt the foreigners made to either discover or create a cure for the flood had failed. But it was said that the First Prophet knew the answer to the humans' supposed immunity, and plus the foreigners themselves had witnessed firsthand the humans coexisting with the flood. Obviously a form of immunization or resistance or vaccine or cure had to exist, surely, right? Well, unfortunately not, at least not in a conventional sense. Initially, what the foreigners believed to have been humanity's cure was, in fact, the greatest self-sacrifice known to man. The humans had no cure. Instead, they genetically modified a third of their overall population with self-destructive genes that were meant to target the flood on a genetic level, and then sacrificed that population to the flood, a plan that clearly, it seems, had worked in some capacity. However, even this turned out to be a red herring. The mythical cure was in fact the flood playing the long game in pursuit of vengeance. So, because the Flood are reborn, corrupted precursors, their existence is a form of vengeance in and of itself against the foreigners. So, think of the Flood inherently as anti-foreigner. However, it's the reason the Foreigners genocided the Precursors that is, in fact, the root of the supposed cure. When choosing a species to pass the mantle of responsibility down to, and thus pass dominion over the galaxy and its species down to, the Precursors had chosen humanity over the Foreigners, but because the two species were rivals, the Foreigners were enraged into a genocide. Because the Flood are a form of Precursor, they still uphold their original form's wish to have the humans hold the mantle, while also being the physical embodiment of vengeance for the Foreigners. So, they killed two birds with one stone. Not only did they halt their infection of ancient humanity and retreat to ensure that they weren't sent into extinction, but they also led the Foreigners on a wild goose chase, causing them to spend countless millennia and vast numbers of precious wartime resources searching for something that didn't even exist. In fact, now that I think about it, they kind of killed a third bird with that stone too. In sending the Foreigners on that wild goose chase, they also ensured that humanity wouldn't fall into extinction by their hand either. Now, they have a very weird way of showing it, but in a way, everything the Flood does kind of has our best interests at heart. But you might be asking, well, in Bungie's trilogy, it was pretty apparent that the Flood didn't have our best interests at heart, so what's the deal with that then? Well, my friend, it's here that we get to talk about a tale as old as time on this channel. The Precursors' final test for the mantle. Humanity don't just inherit the mantle. The Precursors may have chosen them to inherit it, but they still have to prove themselves as worthy to hold it. And according to the Primordial, the last Precursor, that will only happen by passing the Precursors' final test, which comes in the form of a Flood outbreak. The only question now is what that Flood outbreak is actually going to be like. There is an argument to be made that the outbreaks that we witnessed during Bungie's trilogy were the Precursors' final test, but personally I strongly disagree with that idea because both of the outbreaks, the one in Halo 1 and the one in Halo 2, were accidental in nature. They weren't caused intentionally. The Precursors' final test, I think at least, needs to be an intentional outbreak. But that's a topic for a different day, and one that I've also covered many times on this channel already. The fact of the matter is, despite hundreds of millennia of investigation, of research and study, no known cure for the Flood has ever existed. Now, with that being said, that doesn't mean that a cure is either impossible or will never exist. In fact, I actually think that Halo Epitaph may have given us our first hint at least a semblance of a cure. In the latter years of the Foreigner Flood War, and also leading into Halo 4 and Halo Escalation, the Didact had the Logic Plague, which, if you don't know, is basically an informational, knowledge-based form of infection. Video coming soon. However, following his composition, he seems to have been entirely cured of the Logic Plague. And so that begs the question, if the Logic Plague can be cured, does that mean that physical Flood infection can be cured as well? Well, yes, it's an entirely different ballgame, but I do think it could be possible. The Didact was definitely onto something when he used a composer to create the Prometheans. By all accounts, they were uninfectable. This is hands down the closest that anyone has ever come to a cure for the Flood. The only problem, of course, is that it comes at the cost of your physical body. Quite the trade-off, and honestly, one that I hope we never have to make. In 2009, we were introduced to the strangest Flood outbreak in all of Halo lore. One that came and went with no explanation, and that simultaneously was one of the most likely outbreaks to lead to total galactic infection. I am of course talking about the seemingly innocuous Flood outbreak on the Shield world in Halo Wars 1. This outbreak is hands down the weirdest that we've ever encountered. How the hell did it start? Why wasn't it contained? Why didn't it spread to other planets? Why aren't the Flood real so I can keep an infection form as a pet? Today, we are finally going to try and get to the bottom of at least most of those questions, and many more as well. So, let's begin by taking a look at the location at which this outbreak takes place. Trove, a shield world. Trove was built by the Foreigners around the time of the Forerunner Flood War, where it served as both a military stronghold and also a safe haven from the Flood and the Halos. Being a shield world, Trove had both an outer region that to the untrained eye seemed no different to a regular planet, and then an inner region, complete with an artificial sun. This inner region was one of the few places in the galaxy that provided shelter from the Halo rings, and access to it was extremely difficult, frankly nigh on impossible for any species besides, of course, the Reclaimers. Sheltered within this inner region was an armada of Sojourner-class dreadnoughts, built just in time for the outbreak of the Forerunner Flood War. These ships were held in a constant ready state, primarily as a failsafe measure so they could destroy the inner region of the world should the Flood somehow break through, but also so they could be used by the surviving Forerunners to explore the dead galaxy once the Halos were fired. During the war itself, the outer surface of Trove came under heavy assault by the Parasite. A vicious battle was fought to hold back the Flood, but ultimately infected numbers were far too great, and the surface was entirely overrun. The world's monitor, 295 Harken Watch, was severely damaged in the process, and so, to allow evacuation efforts into the interior of the world to succeed, 3 brave Promethean warriors, Animus to Remain, Malice Begets Demise, and Habit to Sever, made a final stand against overwhelming numbers of infected, long enough to allow the monitor to retreat into the interior and seal it off, all 3 giving their lives in the process. Now this might seem obvious, but there's a reason that I'm explicitly stating this now, you'll see why later. Their efforts ensured that not a single Flood form made it into Trove's interior. The interior of the world was 100% free of Flood infection. So, the Halos then fired, and the outbreak on Trove's exterior was fully contained. Right? According to existing lore, which is granted very spotty, the Flood's contamination of the Shield World's exterior remained present following the firing of the Halos. Which, of course, if you know literally anything about Halo lore, makes very little sense. And then when the Spirit of Fire and the Covenant arrived in 2531, 100,000 years later, they were greeted by not just the entirety of the world's surface being a Blightland, but also to the presence of a large proto-gravemind. This was humanity's first ever encounter with the Flood, so they didn't really stop to question how little sense their presence made because they were too busy dealing with the fact that 28 days later was all of a sudden no longer a work of fiction. But for better or worse, we are very much used to the Flood now, so goddammit, we are going to question how little sense this makes. So before we look at any possible causes of this outbreak, we first need to look at the insane laundry list of oddities surrounding this outbreak. And the first one isn't even a lore oddity, rather it's a meta detail that is driving me insane. And it's the Halo universe's, frankly, complete and utter refusal to ever expand on this outbreak or even add any more context to it. This outbreak should be very easily explainable, but at every possible opportunity where an explanation could be given, like the encyclopedia, for example, it doesn't get one at all. The outbreak, if anything, just gets glanced over and skirted around. You know, I will admit, part of me does like the mystery that it adds to the outbreak. It harkens back to a time where everything wasn't just explained away in a book or a blog post somewhere. A time when you had to actually fill in a lot of the gaps in Halo's lore yourself, using your own imagination, which is a time that I do quite dearly miss. But, you know, even still, I just find it so very strange. It's almost as if it's being done on purpose. Anyway, the first in-universe lore oddity about this outbreak is the obvious one, right? How the hell did the Flood on the surface of Trove survive the firing of the Halos? Only the interior of the world is immune to their pulse. The surface is just like any other planet, 100% susceptible. And then, by extension, the next oddity is the lack of any conclusive evidence as to precisely when this outbreak began. For the longest time, the only lore that we had stated that the outbreak on the surface was the very same outbreak that consumed the world during the Forerunner Flood War 100,000 years ago, and that it somehow survived the firing of the Halos. But in 2016, the origins of this outbreak received some new and, quite frankly, equally befuddling context. In one of the lore drops that was included in the Halo loot crates, a post-war scan of Trove's debris concluded that there was a chance this outbreak was, quote, recent, which implies that it wasn't the same outbreak as the one that consumed the planet during the war. However, this analysis was entirely probability-based. It didn't confirm nor deny the existing explanation of the outbreak at the time. It simply posited that it could have been a recent outbreak. You could also argue, if you wanted to get really pedantic, that recent could just be referring to the fact that the Spirit of Fire's encounter with the Flood was recent, not that the outbreak itself was recent. Yes, I know I'm overanalyzing, I overanalyze stuff way too much, but given how few details we have about this outbreak, I feel like overanalyzing is kind of a necessity. Another oddity that's less so pertaining to the origin of the outbreak and more so its spread is how it managed to get into the interior of the Shield world in the Halo Wars campaign. We know for a fact that the interior was 100% free of infection during the Forerunner Flood War, and that when we got down there, its environment was entirely uninfected, unlike the surface of the planet, which was very clearly a fully infected Blightland. So, their intrusion clearly happened far more recently than their outbreak on the surface. It's also safe to assume that they didn't reach the interior via the Spirit of Fire either. There's no talk of an outbreak inside the ship, and I mean, we definitely would have known if there was one, and any that were attached to the ship's exterior were very clearly destroyed by the Sentinels and the Cleansing Ring. I mean, it is unequivocally confirmed at the end of the level called Cleansing that the ship is entirely free of Flood. So, that means that the only explanation for this is that either they somehow managed to brute force their way into the interior through the vents and through other tunnels similar to the one that the Spirit of Fire went down, or that they breached the interior in the same mysterious and unexplained way that Regret managed to. Either way, there's no sound explanation for them getting through. I swear, this outbreak has oddities coming out of every orifice. As for the Flood and their Blightland on the surface, well, a major oddity with this is why the hell was it never contained? Granted, the Sentinels do only appear for the first time once the tunnel opens up to let the Spirit of Fire into the interior, so maybe keeping the existence of that interior region a secret was the utmost priority for the Monitor? But come on, there's no way that it prioritized that over containing a vast, rampant Flood outbreak that was spreading across the surface of its installation that could have very easily spread off-world and consumed the rest of the galaxy. I mean, granted, it wouldn't be the first time that a Monitor made a silly decision, but come on. That's more than silly.
That's insane.
The interior of Trove wasn't infected, like, at all either, so, I mean, what the hell were the Sentinels doing down there that was deemed more important than containing the outbreak? Maybe they didn't want to risk exposing the interior to infection by opening up a tunnel so they could head out to the surface and eradicate the outbreak, but I don't know, that just seems like an absurdly bad decision to leave an outbreak of this magnitude festering for so long that it was able to make a proto-gravemind this large. And I guess another oddity that kind of stems from that is why the hell didn't the Flood spread off Trove? Well, thankfully, for the sake of my sanity, this is about the only oddity in this entire video that is actually quite easily explainable. There are actually several reasons why I think the Flood didn't spread off Trove. Firstly, Trove wasn't inhabited by any species capable of space travel, nor was it seemingly ever visited by any foreign species who were also capable of space travel. For all intents and purposes, Trove kind of just seems like one big nature reserve, which explains why there were so many unique combat forms that we've never seen elsewhere. Secondly, even if they did infect a species that were capable of space travel, they only had a proto-gravemind and likely wouldn't have been intelligent enough to utilize FTL travel. Granted, Flood under command of a proto-gravemind are able to fly smaller craft, like the Spirit that they flew off Alpha Halo to infect the Infinite Succor, for example, but having the psychological processing power and knowledge to accurately jump through slipspace almost certainly requires a gravemind, of which this outbreak did not have. Frankly, I think the only reason that it didn't have a gravemind was because the only species they had to infect were unintelligent and didn't provide enough biomass nor brain power to create one. Quite honestly, I think we kind of looked out there. But of course, the main oddity that I want to try and get to the bottom of in this video is how in the hell this outbreak actually began in the first place. there are a number of possible causes that I want to go over, starting out with what is, quite honestly, the most cookie-cutter one: a containment breach. Now, yes, it's the most obvious and commonly occurring source of an outbreak in the entire universe. It happened on Alpha Halo, Delta Halo, and the Ark, among many other locations. And because of the Foreigners' incessant obsession with storing Flood on every single one of their installations, this is the most likely explanation. Except, it might not be. There's actually no evidence anywhere to suggest that shield worlds have flood containment facilities, and trust me, I scoured just about every single source of Halo lore out there. I felt like Gandalf at Minas Tirith. Maybe that's just because humanity hasn't explored many shield worlds yet, but as the lore stands right now, and also as the lore stood in 2009 when Halo Wars first released, there is no evidence to suggest that True was home to either a flood research facility or really any preserved flood specimens of any kind. And after all, why the hell would it be? Shield worlds were designed as safe havens from both the Halos and primarily from the Flood. And what kind of army would be stupid enough to store specimens of the zombies that they're trying to shelter from in the very safe haven that they built to shelter from them? I mean, come on, nobody would ever be that stupid.
I'm Major Henry West.
The only other installation that the Foreigners designed as a safe haven, the Ark, also didn't have any flood containment facilities, for, again, obvious reasons. So why would the shield worlds? It makes no sense. If for the sake of argument though, you do want to say that Trove had some flood specimens somewhere, we just never found them for whatever reason, then you could argue that with the monitor being damaged, that his security protocols would have been far more lax, kind of like Penitent Tangent in Halo 2. Or that somehow Regret coming to the world and meddling with it in some way caused a containment breach, kind of like Halo 1. But the fact of the matter is that the shield worlds don't have containment facilities for obvious reasons, so all of that is irrelevant. And this makes that bit of lore that we got in 2016 that suggested that the outbreak was recent even more confusing, because if it was recent, then where the bloody hell did it come from? Well, one option was that maybe prior to 2531, when everyone arrived at Trove, there was an outbreak on another world somewhere that somehow entirely evaded both our radars and the Covenant's radars, and grew so large that it managed to spread off that world and reach Trove, but I find that highly unlikely. We sure as hell would have known about it. Another option is that they came to Trove with Regret's fleet, but, how? Their last location was Harvest, and I'm pretty sure there were no Flood on Harvest, so that's also entirely moot as well. The only other explanation for this outbreak being recent is if, when Trove was initially overrun during the war, some Flood did manage to sneak into its interior, but instead of spreading, they chose to remain dormant and lie undetected so they could shelter from the Halos and then break out to the surface at a later date and spread. Given that the monitor was severely damaged, maybe he wasn't able to enact containment protocols that were sufficient enough to detect them? To be honest though, this just seems entirely nonsensical as well, because if the monitor somehow didn't detect them, then you'd assume that some kind of containment protocol within Trove or some kind of subroutine in the Sentinel network that, is in place to contain flood outbreaks would have somehow picked up on their existence. As the lore already dictates, I am more than willing to assume that prior to Halo Wars 1, the interior of Trove was never once compromised by the Flood. Any attempt to rationalize a change to that fact just makes no sense whatsoever. And so, whichever way you slice it, I don't think there's a single way in which the cause of this outbreak could have been recent. So, if we assume that it wasn't, and that it is in fact the very same outbreak that overran the surface during the Foreigner Flood War, that leaves us with yet another baffling question. Why the hell wasn't it eradicated when the Halos were fired? And, well, the only explanation for this is that, for some strange reason, the shield world was travelling through slipspace when the Halos were fired, and thus was never hit by their pulse. But that's also just a stupid explanation. Why would a planet that was known to be overrun with the Flood be moved to a dimension that the Halo rings couldn't reach right at the moment of their firing? There's no way to rationalize such stupidity, even by arguing that the monitor was damaged or defunct, which caused it to do stupid stuff. Nah, I'm sorry, that just doesn't make any sense. As I'm sure you can tell, I have really scraped the bottom of the barrel in this video to try and find some possible way to explain how this outbreak began, right? I have literally tore my hair out trying to find one, and I genuinely don't think one exists. And honestly, I think the reason that neither Ensemble, nor Bungie, nor 343 later on ever gave this outbreak an explanation is because it's almost impossible to rationalize. It was originally said to be the same outbreak from the Forerunner Flood War, but there's no logical way in which it could have survived the firing of the Halos. Then they insinuate that the outbreak could have been recent as of 2531, but again, there's no possible manner in which it could have begun on Truve or begun elsewhere in the galaxy and spread to Truve. There is simply no way to explain this outbreak. I feel like what happened here was Ensemble Studios kind of built the overall structure of Halo Wars' story, and then later on, once that structure was locked in, they then decided they really want to include the Flood, so they kind of just had to have them show up at the most fitting location, which ended up being the Forerunner location, without really thinking about the canon rationale behind them actually being there. After all, this was during the Bungie era where Rule of Cool dominated everything else.
Halo 2 is about guns and more guns. That's what it's about.
And they were a really fun addition to both the story and the gameplay. I mean, fighting the Flood in an RTS format was so cool. And so even though, yeah, like their inclusion seems completely nonsensical, I am still very happy that Ensemble decided to include them regardless. Halo Wars is just such a comfy game. It looks and feels and sounds quintessentially Halo. It's really clear that Ensemble went out of their way to reuse as many components of the Bungie games as possible, from UI styles and sound effects to the present factions and enemies, to make their radical new entry in the franchise still feel so authentically Halo, whilst at the same time being so new and different. And of course, in pursuing that broad, sweeping design philosophy, that meant that they had to include all of the enemy types that we saw in Bungie's games as well. The UNSC, the Covenant, the Sentinels, and of course, the Flood. Man, that is a design philosophy that I would do so many things for Halo to return to. This story is simply titled Hunger. It's a short, or well, very short story actually, from the 2010 re-release of The Flood that's told from the perspective of an infection form and also its host, both before, during, and then also after the excruciating process of infection. Now, because of the state of its protagonist, the story is told in a very incoherent manner. The infection form, as expected, has very limited and very primitive thoughts, but when the infection begins and the perspective shifts to the man being infected, who, mind you, is one of Johnson's men, it gets a little bit more coherent, albeit still very disjointed, because of the extreme physical and mental pain that he's experiencing, as the infection form snaps and breaks his bones, necrotizes and consumes his flesh from the inside, and steals control of his body and his most precious thoughts, all while he's still alive. Now, I could explain the entire story to you like this, but frankly, I don't think it'd do it justice. This story, it's just much easier if I read it to you. So, here we go.
Sound, cold, hunger, hunger, sound, motion, cold, motion, hunger, barrier, hunger, light, sound, hunger, warmth, freedom, hunger, searching, searching, hunger, warmth, sound, fear, surging, jump, texture, wet, sound, other, food, not food, hunger, sound, hunger, searching, searching, pain, sound, searching, hunger, sound, searching, jump, food, feast, borrow, feast, become, become, become.
Make it stop. Jesus, God, get it off of me.
Become, spine, pierce, change, feast, grow, food, many food, become.
Birthday. Love. Oh God, it hurts. First time I met her. Where's Johnson? Oh God, it hurts. It hurts.
Become, break, feast, tear, knit, borrow, become.
Boot camp. What's your name? Anna. Birthday. It's tearing me apart. Where's Johnson? Kill me, please, God.
Become, sees, sight, smell, pain, decay, move, Anna, stand, food, create, become.
So hungry. Can't look. Son's birthday tomorrow. Pain, me. I'm not me. Slipping. Son, pistol. End it. Son.
Become, weapon, steel, hand, others becoming, sun, paw, move, shoot, hunger, become.
Hungry. Others together. No, don't touch him. Me. Paul. Run. Together. Last target down. Success. Together.
Become, others becoming, others here, many, covenant, autumn, food, many, freedom, autumn, ship, become.
Hungry. Pillar of autumn. Paul. No, don't. Hungry. Anna. Food. Survivors. Nearby. Engineering is on level 4. Hungry.
Become, ship, freedom, food, Paul, Anna, food, become.
Hungry. Oh God, Paul. I'm so sorry. No end. Food. Freedom. Reach. Hungry.
Become, freedom, food, together, become,
Food. Paul.
become,
Forgive me.
become.
So, the mixture of the excruciating physical pain that the Marine goes through and the immense psychological pain as well of the memories of his family and his son are a pretty hard combo. I mean, he can't even log out, so to speak, either, because right as he's about to, the infection form takes control again and stops him from doing it. And it even goes as far as injecting his wife and son's memories into the Flood hive mind as well, with likely the intent one day of twisting and contorting them the same way that it has done to him. I mean, it even refers to them as food. Truly horrifying. If you ask me, that's kind of on par with the Jenkins infection, quite honestly. Next up, we have a story with no actual name. It's one that's just referred to by its in-universe designation. Entry 47-2396/10763. A highly redacted Oni analysis of a priority distress call from a UNSC private whose entire squad had been consumed by the Flood. These logs, again, come courtesy of the re-release of The Flood, and as such, they take place on Alpha Halo during the Flood outbreak. Now, given that this was the first outbreak that could be actually relayed back to Oni High Command, it was also their first ever encounter with the parasite as well. The private, whose name and designation were redacted, landed with his squad in their life pod from the autumn right into the heart of the Alpha Halo outbreak. He has no idea where they landed, and all his squad mates have been consumed by these strange creatures that he knows are not the Covenant. As the last survivor, he's trapped inside the life pod, where he sends this frantic distress call. He exclaims that his team are dead, or worse, constantly interrupting himself, panicking that the distress call isn't actually sending. Perpetually short on breath, his statements are short. He begs for somebody, for anybody to pick up, and for someone to come and help. In his hysteria, he says that everybody from the autumn is gone. He doesn't think that anyone else is alive, that these things he's encountered are worse than the Covenant, before again panicking about the message not being received. He once again states that these creatures are unlike anything that they've ever encountered. They're everywhere, and they don't stop. He then begins to sob uncontrollably, and the desperation kicks in. Speaking into the LifePod's microphone, he begs to go home. He doesn't want to be here anymore. He just wants to go home. He just wants someone, anyone, to reply to him and say something. There's then a new sound that the mic picks up on the LifePod's exterior, increasing in decibels. The subject is not alone. He too then picks up on the sounds outside and declares that they are coming. They're like giant roaches, like monsters that he can't fight. His sobbing gets louder and more frantic as he realizes that nobody's there. There's no one on the other end of the distress call. Nobody's listening to him. There's nobody coming to save him. He confesses how scared he is, how much he just wants to go home, but nobody's getting the distress call because, as far as he knows, there's nobody left to get it. Everyone's gone. It's just him. Just him and them. He's all alone. The exterior sounds continue. He says that he can hear them, like they're scratching on his brain. The way they move and what they do, they don't just kill you, they change you. They're here. To anyone who gets this message, to anyone out there who might see it or hear it, he says that he's sorry. And then, a single M6C Magnum shot is heard, and the audio transcript ends. So this is another short one, but it's a prime example of the extreme psychological distress and anguish that the mere presence of the Flood inflict on potential hosts, especially those who have no idea what they actually are. The Flood are a terrifying entity either way, but to be entirely ignorant about their existence and suddenly get jumped by them, watch your entire squad get infected and turn, and then be hunkered down in this tiny claustrophobic life pod all alone with nobody coming to save you as they get closer and closer, is a level of terrifying that not many other Flood interactions yield. This story, and also Hunger, are two extremely underrated Flood stories that nobody talks about, likely because of the rather obscure niche release of the book that they're tied to, but they deserve a lot more praise than they get. And finally, we have one of my favourite short stories in the entirety of Halo lore that is extremely harrowing, but in a rather different and unique way. Summer the Painter. Now for this one, you need a little bit of backstory. When the Flood first emerged in ancient human space, their rapid consumption quickly drove the humans back into Foreigner-controlled space, which the Foreigners deemed an act of war. This led to them wiping their human rivals out once and for all and resetting them back to the Stone Age. But mysteriously, at the same time, the parasite seemed to recede as well, almost in an act of defeat. Rumour quickly spread throughout the Foreigner ecumene that the humans had found a miracle cure. Others believed that they'd found not a cure, but an antidote, so to speak. They genetically modified 1/3 of their entire species population to destroy the Flood, and then sacrificed that third of their population to the parasite, which in turn destroyed them. However, there were many who doubted these claims and rumours, and so, despite the Flood vanishing, they remained steadfast in their research for some kind of counter, or a vaccine, or an antidote, or a cure. But for 8,500 years, the Flood were never seen, or encountered, or even heard of. That was until one horrifyingly fateful day on the serene, distant planet of Seaward. Seaward was a retreat planet for wealthy foreigners who wished to shed their armour, their personal AIs, and all of their hyper-advanced technology for a more simple life, one that allowed them to reconnect with the nature that their species' advancement had forsaken. It was in fact home to roughly 1 million who chose this primitive path. Designated G617G1, the planet itself was located right on the edge of both Foreigner space and the galaxy itself, far from the centre of the ecumene and really any other planets in general. Every now and then, resupply balloons would come to drop supplies off for the colony, but for all intents and purposes, they were almost entirely disconnected in every way from the rest of the ecumene, as was the intention of its inhabitants. In 97,764 BC, Seaward inhabitant Summer left her small bustling town of Wharftown to capture something truly unique. Soma was a painter, and was attempting to capture the moment two fire began in the sky. Now, two fire was an optical effect that was caused by the light from Seaward's two suns passing under the horizon and reflecting off the scattered clouds above. She painted onto a glass easel using a jet brush, which was a foreigner kind of paintbrush that sprayed smart pigments onto the glass automatically. Basically, it painted whatever she saw. To capture such an extraordinary occurrence, Soma had ascended to a hill above Wharftown, from which she had a perfect view of the azure expanse of the sea and the distant white-capped mountains beyond the reef that had now picked up motes of pink. Seaward was a truly beautiful little world, ideal for foreigners who wish to forsake their overbearing technology and live a simpler, more peaceful, quiet life. Its existence was funded by the art and energy that those elite few who called it home created, and those further into the heart of the galaxy who purchased from Seaward's elite made a conscious effort to keep its existence a secret. To 99.9% of the foreigner population, Seaward didn't exist. As the planet's two suns moved closer together, the motors in Soma's jetbrush began to spool up. The two fire lit up the sky, reflecting perfectly off the clouds, turning them pink, then crimson, then green, then blue, before fading back to pink. The two fire's majesty caused Soma's eyes to well up with tears, and after wiping them, she glanced down at her easel. The rainbow array of lights had been captured perfectly on the skyscape that she'd already painted, and she thought to herself, wonderful. Until she took a closer look at the pattern, and her amazement turned to confusion. It looked as though the jetbrush had malfunctioned. There was a strange flaw at the heart of Two Fire's light. A dark grey streak, a dirty charcoal imperfection drawn through the centre of the other hues in a floundering arc, trailing a sickly yellow smoke behind it. The smear looked ominous, and as Soma gave the sky above her a quick momentary glance, fear set in. That same imperfection hung there in the pink sky, very real, baleful, moving steadily and purposefully toward the horizon. Something was coming. Something was wrong. She hastily folded her easel, packed her jetbrush and belongings up, and hurried back down the hill to Wharftown. This day in 97,764 BC marked the Flood's final return to the galaxy, and Seaward was its first target. Now earlier I mentioned that Seaward was designated Colony G617. Well, in the book of Genesis, passage 617, it reads, "For behold, I will bring a flood of waters upon the earth to destroy all flesh in which is the breath of life under heaven. Everything that is on the earth shall die." Halo's universe is the epitome of an iceberg. On the surface, it just seems like a badass black and white tale of super soldiers and heroes defeating everything in their path to ensure humanity's survival, whatever the cost. But take one peek beneath the surface and you start to realise that binary view is a lot murkier than you first thought. In fact, Halo's a series where really nobody is the good guy, us very much included. Our supposedly heroic future selves are propped up on a history of war crimes, propaganda, heinous atrocities, crimes against humanity, against nature, extreme disinformation campaigns, and so much more. Much like in the real world, the various governments and their sub-agencies in Halo only reveal 1% of what they truly know to the world. The other 99% is either so morally and ethically bankrupt or so likely to cause mass hysteria that it's covered in black ink. But nothing is more redacted than the events of November 17th, 2552, a day that those few who survived will never forget. The Flood invasion of Earth. Today, we're going to dive into the most classified documents in the history of Oni to understand how they managed to cover up not just the Flood's existence, but also their outbreak on Earth. We're also going to cover the potential conspiracies that circulate throughout the general population about these zombies that the government are hiding. And I think by the end, we might all be in agreement that this act by the Office stands as a monument to all their sins. So let's begin with the most egregious outbreak that Oni covered up. The outbreak in Voi on November 17th, 2552. This outbreak was, and still is, arguably the most significant event in Earth's history. The Flood, the hateful, corrupted, zombie parasite descendants of the gods, made landfall on the homeworld of humanity, the very species that the foreigners sacrificed everything to save from them. The historical significance of this event is staggering, to say the least, but even to boil it down to more simple terms, the mere fact that there was a literal zombie outbreak in Eastern Africa was a huge deal, one that should, by all accounts, have caused mass civil unrest across the entire planet, hell, across all the remaining colonies. But it didn't, and that was only in part thanks to Oni. Elite shipmaster Artas Vadum had the foresight to know how fast the flood would spread if scorched earth measures weren't immediately taken to halt them.
One single flood spore can destroy a species. Were it not for the Arbitrus Council, I would have glassed your entire planet.
And so, within less than an hour of the outbreak beginning, he ordered his fleet to glass half the African continent, destroying all the flood that made it to Earth and neutralizing the outbreak, at the cost of half a continent and many innocent lives. And what's morbidly funny about this is that, as far as we're currently aware, the top brass within the UNSC was staunchly opposed to this action. I mean, Lord Hood voiced his clear disapproval of Artas's hasty containment procedures during the debrief, even going as far as starting to distrust the shipmaster for his actions. But we ultimately know that, as painful as it was absolutely the right decision. Following the war, Edward Buck and his ODST squad Alpha 9 were sent into what became known as the Voi Exclusion Zone to confirm that the parasite had indeed been destroyed by Artas, and they of course found no traces of flood. The glassing was successful. So, Oni and the UNSC may have played no part whatsoever in containing the flood outbreak in their proverbial living room, one, mind you, that their own model was later predicted would have infected the entirety of Earth in mere hours, but they sure as hell made quick work in covering it up. Now, we're going to discuss the conspiracies about these events later on in the video, but the official story that Oni gave to the world was that Voi suffered a surprise attack by Truth's fleet, rendering the city and the vast region surrounding it glassed. No ancient parasite nor zombie outbreak was ever publicly mentioned, and to the best of their knowledge, no outside civilians found out about the flood either. It was a total mission success. Case closed. But this wasn't the first time they'd had to cover the flood up. Following the Alpha Halo outbreak, we never experienced any chatter or even offhand mentions of the flood outside of those few who survived it, and also Dr. Horsey, who had to conduct tests on Jonathan just to make sure he wasn't infected. Hell, even the Marines on Delta Halo had no idea what the flood were when they first fought them in the Sentinel Wall.
Negative, ma'am. They are not Covenant. Cover that doorway!
So clearly, the flood's existence didn't even spread throughout the Marine Corps, and if the Marines didn't know about it, then the general public sure as hell didn't either. Now granted, there were very, very few survivors of the Alpha Halo outbreak to actually spread knowledge of the flood in the first place, but it's clear that neither those few who survived nor any of the top brass who knew about it leaked anything about the parasite to the public. Oni managed to prevent any and all information about its existence from leaking to the press or to civilians, besides one strange exception. So the only individual outside of the survivors and top brass who did somehow know about the flood was Sergeant Lopez, who somehow knew about Chief fighting them on the ring. And this strange oddity leads us very nicely into the next cover-up, because don't worry, they don't stop there. Oni's attempts to turn the flood into their very own bioweapon through the means of human experimentation aboard the Mona Lisa were also kept under a heavy coating of black ink, as I'm sure you can imagine. The sole Oni agent in charge of the operations on board the Mona Lisa, Major John Smith, was very clearly an individual hidden behind several layers of false identity. The name John Smith is the textbook age-old false identity name. It's the male equivalent of Jane Doe. His real name is likely very heavily redacted. But further to this, John Smith completely vanished following his escape from the Mona Lisa. When he was taken aboard the Prowler, the Red Horse, its commander, Fukao, detained him, but he remarked that if he was indeed part of Oni Section 3, then they'd likely just use him as a scapegoat if the need arose and just wash their hands of his work. But here's the interesting thing. Nothing in the existing lore has ever suggested that such a need ever arose, and John Smith was never heard from again. So, did Oni dispense of John Smith and we just never heard about it? Or did they give him another new identity and let him continue his inhumane, evil experiments elsewhere? My money is definitely on the latter. Either way, given that the mere existence of the Mona Lisa, let alone what went down on the ship, has never been mentioned or even referenced once in the 8+ years since it happened, it's very obvious that Oni managed to successfully cover up everything that they were doing on the ship and also how it all went south. Now, there is one extra detail surrounding the Mona Lisa events that really drives home Oni's efforts to keep the flood concealed, and that is the fact that not one member of the crew who was sent to investigate why the Mona Lisa had gone dark were informed of the flood. Even their Prowler commander, Fukao, not even he was, and it's heavily implied that, besides Lopez of course, none of them even knew that the flood existed prior to engaging them on the ship. If even those who are sent to contain their outbreaks aren't informed of their existence, then I think that really goes to show how active the office are in ensuring that the flood remain the most tightly kept secret in all of human history. After all, humanity as a species have practically grown up with zombie stories. Movies, TV shows, video games, books, comics, myths and legends. The fictional concept of the dead rising up to feast on the living has existed for thousands upon thousands of years. Hell, it's even present in the Bible. And if the general populace were to learn about the existence of a species that legitimized every single one of those fictional horror stories and metaphorical religious tales, well, they descend into total anarchy. Okay, let's move on now to talk a little bit about the both confirmed and also hypothetical flood-related information leaks and also official releases that have occurred so far. In the years following the end of the war and also Master Chief's disappearance, a short service was held to commemorate the dead, in which a speech was given by an unknown UNSC commander. He mentions various individuals by name who lost their lives to the Covenant, but towards the end, he says the following.
Brave soldiers who sacrificed everything to eliminate the flood.
As far as we're aware, this is the most public acknowledgement of the flood for quite some time following our first encounter with them, but how public it was exactly is up in the air. There was only a small crowd of servicemen in the hall, and whether the speech was broadcast galaxy-wide or kept small and discreet is unknown. My money is definitely on the latter, and if that is the case, then it's fair to assume that all the service people in the room either already knew about the flood, or were extremely high-ranked and, for lack of better phrasing, knew classified information when they heard it. There is always the chance that this was transmitted galaxy-wide, but I strongly doubt Oni would have given the go-ahead for them to just name-drop the flood in a speech that was ultimately going to be heard by trillions of people. Okay, actually, real quick, I've got a very short crackpot theory to talk about regarding this. So, if this was actually broadcast galaxy-wide, I can imagine Oni pulling some kind of Hunt the Truth meets Metal Gear Solid style censorship with the actual term, the flood, to ensure that the public heard something different. Kinda like how in Metal Gear Solid, the term the Patriots is translated into Lale Lule Lo by anybody with nanomachines to conceal their existence.
Just a messenger from the Lali Lulelo.
Yes, this is a massive stretch based on almost no existing lore, but come on, it's Oni, you never know. Either way though, I think it's more likely that they just didn't broadcast this beyond a very small group of people who were already in the know. With all that said though, something that we haven't accounted for yet regarding flood-related leaks is just the simple chatter among Marines who survived them. Now, granted, not many did survive the flood, but there are absolutely going to be just some regular basic Marine survivors of the Delta Halo outbreak, or the Voy outbreak, or the Ark outbreak out there, and there's no way in hell not a single one of them has ever gone to a bar, gotten absolutely wasted, and mentioned the flood. Don't get me wrong, Oni definitely placed the strongest of gag orders about the Flood on any survivors at the end of the war. But come on, gag orders don't really mean much when you're halfway down a bottle of whiskey, or when a journalist comes to you and offers you your entire net worth 10 times over to anonymously leak classified government war secrets. I refuse to believe that not one single survivor of the war has ever even breathed a word about the Flood, even if they were absolutely hammered on some backwater colony somewhere in some dive bar. I just think there's a negative percentage chance that they've not let their existence slip at least once. However, thanks to Kilo 5, we know, at least indirectly, that this has happened in some capacity. Somehow, somewhere, somebody leaked what happened in Voy. It turns out Oni's OPSEC wasn't as tight as they thought it was. Outer Colony arms dealer Staffan Sensuke knew the truth about Voy. He knew that the surprise Covenant glassing was a cover-up, and that the reality was something much, much more horrifying: the Flood. But then again, he was also adamant that his daughter had been kidnapped by the government at age 6 and replaced with a clone, so what did he know? Now, I'll be honest, it's been a very long time since I last read Kilo 5, but from what I remember, this wasn't like a commonly known fact on Venetia. It wasn't like Sensuke had dedicated his entire life to spreading the truth about the Voy outbreak, because, well, as we know, he was far too dedicated and obsessed with that absolutely crazy, insane, wild conspiracy theory about the government kidnapping his daughter and replacing her with a clone. Crazy theory, right? He was also an insurrectionist living on the insurrection stronghold colony of Venetia, so even if he had spread the information, it would have been so easy for Oni to just peddle some propaganda throughout the inner colonies that just writes it off as some insane outer colony conspiracy theory, because, I mean, come on paper, it sure as hell does sound like a crazy conspiracy theory. It does make you wonder how he learned the truth about Voy, though. I mean, the two most likely sources are either a direct leak from someone that he knew in the military, or a journalist of some kind who managed to upload video evidence of what actually went down in Voy to Waypoint that Sensuke managed to download before Oni inevitably wiped it. And you know what? That's another thing that I want to briefly touch on. Given the scale of the Voy outbreak, I absolutely staunchly refuse to believe that not one single person whipped out their phone, or whatever the 2552 equivalent of a phone is, and started filming the Flood. Nowadays, if that kind of thing happened, literally the first thing that 99% of people would do is pull out a phone and start recording, right? Literally the first thing. I guarantee if a Flood outbreak happened on Earth today, you would see a billion tweets or TikToks or YouTube shorts or Instagram reels, or hell, you'd even see like IRL streamers flocking to the outbreak to stream it and record it for content. I guarantee. And you cannot convince me that that wouldn't be the case in the future as well. Hell, maybe it did happen, but just like in Hunt the Truth, when Ben Giro leaked the truth about the Spartans, Oni just ran a perfectly concocted smear campaign that discredited the entire thing, and then locked the journalist up in Midnight Facility until their bitter end. 343, story idea. Either way, they've done it before to contain leaks, and I have no reason to doubt that they'd do it again. Another highly overlooked potential source of a leak is the elites. Now, we're very much allied with the elites, and in some cases, are even actively mixing with them in social settings in the post-war era. And you gotta wonder how compliant the elites would be with Oni gag orders. Yeah, we might be close to them now, but there are absolutely still tensions between us and their species. I mean, that's the entire foundation of the Kilo 5 trilogy, and I really can't see an elite bending the knee to strict human rules, just like I couldn't see a human bending the knee to strict elite rules. And so, is it too crazy to wonder if the elites, who historically have actually faced the Flood more than humans, have ever even once uttered their existence to unknowing humans? I'd say that there's a decent likelihood of that happening at least once. However, it's here where we reach a rather interesting twist in this story. So clearly Oni have come to the same realization that we did about, well, the frank practical impossibility of keeping knowledge of the Flood contained. And they also know better than anybody that if you get out ahead of a leak rather than try and play catch up, it becomes much easier to control the fallout that that leak might cause. The perfect example of this, once again, being the case of Ben Giro. And so, in the years following the end of the war, the UNSC established Outpost Discovery, a glorified propaganda initiative that was meant to act as an educational tool and also a mobile recruitment station aimed at the next generation of UNSC personnel. Its main goal was to arm humanity with knowledge of their own history and galaxy, and part of this was an exhibition about various entities that we encountered during the war, one of which was what can only be described as a taxidermied infection form. Now, Outpost Discovery was open to the public. Literally anybody could go and see this thing in the flesh, which I think was the top brass's first attempt at exposing civilians to the existence of the Flood, but in a manner that allowed them to control what and how much they saw, and also the context that they saw it in. Rather than their first exposure to the Flood being some horrifying leaked shaky cam footage of the civilians of Voy being infected as their entire city is consumed with a thick, sickly fog, they instead see a disgusting yet entirely harmless infection form behind a thick glass box. Smart play from Oni, I gotta give it to him. The military have also been more exposed to Flood knowledge in recent years as well, again, entirely under Oni's say-so. As a part of the War Games training simulations, Spartan 4s engage in Flood containment simulations. Dedicated Flood containment fire teams now exist as well, a volunteer force of Spartans who commit their combat prowess to specializing in Flood containment measures, and of whom have actually been employed in the post-war years. You never hear of Flood outbreaks because these guys are sent in specifically to contain them, and at least 99% of the time, they're successful. Hell, Gen 2 Mjolnir manufacturers even offer the Flood Visor for use by these teams that is specifically designed for assessment and containment missions into foreigner sites that may contain the parasite. So, overall, it is clear that Oni are starting to lift the black tape on the Flood a little bit nowadays, likely because their hand has been forced by what is, frankly, the utter impossibility of keeping the lid on the Flood's existence forever. However, recent events may have significantly impacted Oni's knowledge and records of the Flood. To prevent information leakage through systems and networks during the Created Uprising, Oni Spartan teams conducted extreme information sanitization operations on Earth, in which the Gen 1 recon helmet was specifically employed. And further, as of Halo Infinite, we now know that Cortana completely obliterated Oni Bravo 6, which is their Sydney-based headquarters on Earth, with a Guardian. And so, how many records, files, and how much data Oni had on the Flood has now been destroyed by both of these efforts? We don't know for sure, but the combination of Oni's asset denial informational sanitization and also Cortana's literal physical sanitization of Bravo 6 suggests to me that neither party allowed much of that data to survive. How this is going to impact future Flood research, experimentation, and also leaks is up in the air, but if you ask me, I think the current state of the galaxy might bring us into a Wild West era of leaks and data trading when it comes to the Flood. Today, we're going into the gory, disturbing details behind the infection, torture, and assimilation of Captain Jacob Keyes. The torture and mutilation Keyes endured at the hand of the Flood was arguably the worst the parasite had ever inflicted in their 100,000-year history. We're talking physical mutilation, psychological mutilation, emotional mutilation, and much, much more. And in a very fitting fashion, if my voice sounds kind of off in this video, it's because I'm ill. Flu or something like that. I think after the last video, the Flood finally got to me, so if I suddenly just stop posting videos or posting on Twitter or anything, then it's probably because I'm part of a grave mind. Yeah, you might want to watch out for that. But anyways, let's begin the tingling of the spine. This terrifying tale begins on the 20th of September, 2552. Following his rescue from the Truth and Reconciliation, Captain Keyes made his way back to the UNSC's forward operating base on Alpha Halo, aptly named Alpha Base. Sometime before, an elite by the name of Qualamy was captured and taken back to the base for interrogation. Now, for reasons unclear, this elite had become apparently disillusioned with the Covenant and was very willing to dish out tactical secrets to the UNSC. He revealed the location of a major weapons cache hidden deep within one of the Halo swamps, and immediately a robust fire team was formed to investigate. Sergeant Major Avery Johnson joined up with Fireteam Charlie, who took part in the raid on the Truth and Reconciliation, as well as Second Squad, and the group were led by none other than the recently rescued Captain Keyes. Bit of a ballsy move from the captain, but I respect it. Wasting little time, the Coalition boarded a Pelican and headed to the coordinates provided by the Elite. The reason they'd assembled such a large strike team was because they very clearly expected heavy Covenant resistance. But when they arrived at the swamp facility, they found the opposite. It was quiet. Too quiet. For such a seemingly important location, there was a distinct lack of any Covenant. At least until they moved further into the station, where they stumbled across the remains of those who were once stationed here, their bodies mutilated and defiled beyond human comprehension. This clearly wasn't the work of any human soldiers, and it was unlikely that any members of the Covenant were capable of this either, save for maybe the Brutes, but as far as Keyes and the crew were aware, the Brutes were not members of the fleet that followed the Autumn to the Ring. But as puzzled and oddly disturbed as they were, they had a mission to complete, so they pressed forward. Maybe this was just a blessing in disguise. Maybe the weapons cache was left totally unguarded for them to just swoop in and steal without breaking a sweat. If only it was that simple. As we all know, that was far, far from the case. When the team broke through a suspiciously tightly locked door, they hit a dead end, if you'll pardon the pun, and the horror of the facility was unleashed. The Flood. Only a few members of the strike team managed to escape the ambush, and unfortunately, Captain Keyes was not one of them. During the chaos of the outbreak, an infection form had managed to catch him off guard and latch onto his neck, officially beginning the infection process. Now, at this point, the Flood outbreak was very much in its first stage, the feral stage, where constructing a proto-gravemind to command local infected is absolutely paramount. To command efficiently, raw knowledge is required, and so whenever a host is infected, the Flood dig through their brains to see if there's anything of use, and whether there is or not is a deciding factor in how the host's body is used by the parasite. Initially, Keyes was turned into a simple combat form, but as the infection form dug through his memories, the, at the time small, collective consciousness of the Flood realized that this host was far, far too important to become what was essentially cannon fodder. In a vile, sick and twisted way, this lump of biomass was destined for something greater. When Keyes awoke, he had this sudden urge to repeatedly recite his name.
Keyes, Jacob, Captain, service number 01928-19912-JK.
After some repetitions, he then felt a strange sort of intrusion in his mind, a presence, a third party that was angry at him for remembering his name for some reason. Although he was still none the wiser as to where he was, his distorted memory was slowly managing to reform. He remembered hallways full of enemies. Now, he couldn't remember who or what these enemies were, but he could remember that there were far too many of them for his team to handle, followed by a memory of a sharp, intense stabbing pain. Based on that, he assumed that he'd been captured, and that this strange feeling was a new form of interrogation the Covenant were using. So, he continued reciting his name, rank, and service number, denying the enemy any of the secrets that he knew. Secrets about the UNSC, about humanity, and the location of Earth. However, while he was fixated on these repetitions, an intense buzzing pressure was increasing in intensity, deepening its invasion into his mind, which terrified him, yet still he persisted. But little did he know his persistence was futile. All of a sudden, familiar personal images began playing before him, which he quickly realized was the present sifting through his memories like a grave robber, and he was powerless to stop it. Then, he felt the sensation of the first woman that he'd ever kissed, a strangely warm feeling that was ripped away from him in an instant. The feeling was as if his entire essence was being pulled apart right before him, with some pieces being taken for study and others left behind. He tried to hold on to the memories that were being left, but as quickly as he could grab them, they were being stolen from him, and he continued to sink into this bottomless void with nothing to keep him up. time in this state also seemed to just not exist. There was no measure of it, and even if there was, Keyes would not have had the mental capacity to focus on it. All his energy, what little he had left, was spent holding back this presence, when suddenly he realized something. This presence wanted something. It wasn't scanning through his memories for no reason. There was something specific in there that it was after, and as Keyes continued to resist in his consciousness, it came to him. Escape. Fueled by its primordial urge to feed, it wanted to escape the ring to reach a better feeding ground. Earth. Another sharp tendril stabbed into his mind, retrieving images of Earth's sunrise, quickly followed by cows being led into a slaughterhouse. But Keyes managed to resist, replaying memories from his childhood to try and block the intrusion. Knowing full well that it would be the end of everything if this entity were to find Earth, he had only one soul-crushing thing to do. He took all his fondest memories of Earth, from his childhood, his adulthood, and all stages of his life, and forced them down as deep as he could, masking them with more mundane memories like smells, the taste of food, and the like. As the valiant captain that he was prepared to sacrifice anything and everything to protect the last bastion of humanity. Now that Reach had fallen, Earth was all they had left, and if it meant sacrificing everything he held dear to protect it, then he was damn well ready to do that. As he continued to delete his most precious memories, he felt pieces of him slipping away. The essence of who he was falling into the void beneath him. When suddenly, he heard voices. It was Chief and Cortana. Where most people would have been thrilled to hear friendlies coming to rescue them, Keyes was terrified. If this thing managed to capture those two, then all really would be lost. So, in a scream of anguish, he cried out to tell them to leave and get out now.
Don't be a fool. Leave me.
Captain? Captain? I've lost him.
However, it was actually very lucky that the two had arrived when they did. Keyes really was fighting a losing battle, and his defeat was quickly approaching. As his energy depleted, the intruders only increased, as if it could smell that it was getting closer to the information that it sought. As Keyes' light began to fade, his shattered mind slowly shutting down, he could feel death finally encroaching. But it was as if it had been waiting for so long to take him that it wanted to savor the moment, and slowly, second by second, his life force was absorbed, and Captain Jacob Keyes died at the hand of the Flood. When Chief and Cortana finally reached his position, they were horrified. Little to his knowledge, the captain had been used to form the basis of a proto-gravemind, and if they hadn't arrived and taken his CNI transponder when they did, this centralized intelligence would have learned how to fly the Truth and Reconciliation, taken it to Earth, and consumed what little remained of humanity. Captain Keyes died one of the most valiant heroes in the history of humanity. His death was torturous in almost every manner, more excruciating than almost any other form of death imaginable. And yet, despite this, he was still willing to prolong this excruciating, drawn-out process to save billions of lives. Godspeed, sir. Few will ever live up to your legacy. A few days ago, an old friend and I were talking about how good Halo 3's campaign was, just how memorable and replayable it was. But then he mentioned never fully understanding one of its biggest twists, the Flood allying with Chief. And then I suddenly thought, not only have I never covered this groundbreaking event and the reasoning behind it, but I've never covered the importance of it and how it exposes the true horrifying nature of the Flood. So today, I figured it was finally time. So although it may have been obvious to many, why exactly did the most ancient enemy in Halo's universe, who, for the past 10 million years, have been hellbent on consuming anything sentient, choose to join forces with Chief and Arbiter? Well, The answer is pretty damn simple, quite honestly. The entire Halo array was mere moments from firing, which would have wiped out everything in the galaxy, human and Flood included. Despite his crushing defeat outside the Citadel, the Prophet of Truth had managed to make his way to the control room. This was exceptionally bad news for the Allies, because with him, he had the one thing that he needed to fire the Halos, a reclaimer, Sergeant Johnson. As Truth used Johnson to begin the activation process, Chief and Arbiter had only just made it to the bridge that led to the control platform. They still had to fight through an entire militia's worth of Covenant to get to Truth, and time was running out. The Gravemind, whose Flood were even further behind those two, knew how close the Halos were to being fired, and that there simply wasn't enough time to fight through Chief, Arbiter, the Covenant, and then still deactivate the Halos. It also knew that only a Reclaimer could deactivate the Halos, so desperate measures had to be taken. Clearly, Truth posed as much of a threat to the Allies as he did to the Flood, and knowing that both sides were all out of options, the Gravemind offered to help the enemy of its enemy, offering them safe passage to prevent both their destructions, and in doing so, forged a very temporary allegiance with Chief to ensure both parties' safety. Of course, the temporary nature of this alliance meant that almost immediately after the Gravemind got what it wanted, it turned on Chief and Arbiter again. But despite the quick betrayal, this section is hands down one of my favourite bits of Halo's entire story. This cutscene still, to this day, sends shivers down my spine. The combination of the climactic defeatist music, the strong sense of urgency, and the twist being delivered through the Gravemind talking directly to Chief through tank forms that, when they first appear, look like seriously bad news, is just perfect. People can shit-talk Halo 3's story all they want. This scene absolutely perfectly delivers one of the best twists in the entire franchise's history. Sadly, I honestly can't remember how I originally reacted to a lot of the other twists in the original trilogy, but this one is the one that really stuck with me, and it affects me the same today as it did back in 2007. There's just something so damn cool about how the cutscene delivers the twist, and the fact that you're then fighting side by side with the Flood to defeat a common enemy. Okay, so now that I've explained why exactly the Flood were very briefly our allies, you're probably wondering how them laying down arms and helping us, literally the only objectively good thing that they've ever done, exposes their true horror. Well, the reality is, them helping humanity is the terrifying thing, because it's a true sign of their intelligence. One of the things that I always say about the Flood is that their most disturbing trait isn't their appearance, it's not the torturous ways they infect their hosts, and it's not how fast it can spread. It's how damn intelligent they are, and how much knowledge they hold. It is without a shadow of a doubt their most dangerous trait, and without it, their physical capabilities wouldn't be anywhere near what they are. Using this intelligence, they've committed some of the worst small and large-scale atrocities in galactic history. Atrocities that helped bring down entire civilizations without infecting a single host. One of the earliest of these horrifying events was carried out by the Primordial, a creature believed to be the last precursor and the first Gravemind. When it was found by ancient humans years after the precursors were thought to have been eradicated, it was captured and held in human territory. Over time, human scientists learned how to briefly communicate with this creature that they called the Captive. Considering it was clearly a higher being than them, they began treating it as a sort of oracle, trying to attain deep wisdom from it, but their attempts weren't all too successful. At the time, their entire empire was being ravaged by the Flood, so they also tried to seek knowledge about the parasite, how it worked, how to counter its spreading, and, of course, how to defeat it. However, it was when the Captive was asked these very questions that it exposed something truly frightening. When it answered the humans' request to know more about the Flood, it didn't hold back. It told them the reality of this shaping sickness, as they called it. A reality so disturbing that any human who learnt of it committed suicide. All it took was the knowledge held by this Gravemind to convince the humans that death was a better alternative than what was coming. Pretty lethal, if you ask me. But the Primordial's horrifying act didn't stop there. Some years later, it was captured by the Foreigners, who ordered their magnum opus of AIs, Mendicant Bias, to interrogate it on Installation 07. reason 3 billion why Halo Infinite being set on Installation 07 is so fucking exciting. Mendicant Bias was a contender class AI, the most advanced class of AI ever to exist, and was in charge of organising the entire Forerunner military against the Flood. During this ultimately 43-year-long interrogation, the Primordial explained the reality of the Flood, the Mantle of Responsibility, and the Precursor's age-long plans of revenge against the Forerunners to Mendicant. This dark reality crept into the AI's systems, convincing it, somehow, that it was on the wrong side. It was at this moment that the Primordial had managed to infect the Forerunners' most important construct with the Logic Plague, causing it to betray its masters and side with the Flood. By simply explaining the extent of the parasite to Mendicant, nothing more, the Primordial caused not only the near extermination of the entire Ancient Prophet population, but also the downfall of the entire Forerunner Empire. I'm pretty sure that's the Flood's way of saying that the pen is indeed mightier than the sword. The most recent Gravemind on Delta Halo was no stranger to this either. It too used its intelligence to psychologically torture Cortana. When Chief left her behind on High Charity, she was alone with the Gravemind in its hive for 38 long days. Days in which the Gravemind tormented her to learn more about Earth's defenses. But the ways in which it tortured her were far beyond just simply inflicting pain. It made her doubt herself, her intelligence, and her capabilities. By secretly accessing her files and systems, it managed to instill the illusion that it could read her mind, and that it was always one step ahead of her. It made her think that she meant nothing to her human creators, that she was merely a tool of Dr. Halsey and Chief, and that she didn't know what it was like to be truly human, despite actually being the AI equivalent. It replayed the final memories of humans infected by the Flood, forcing her to experience the excruciating mental and physical pain caused by infection. I think it was pretty clear during Halo 3 that the Gravemind was torturing and degrading her, but knowing what actually happened makes it even more horrifying. When she finds the message from Cortana on Earth, you can see her physically suffering, and when he rescues her, you can tell that she's been forced to suffer emotionally too. Her persona is, like, entirely different. It's much more depressive and low than usual, and to be honest, all things considered, I'm not surprised. Some of what the Gravemind did to her may even be permanent as well. One of the first things that she says to Chief when he rescues her is,
"But so much of me is wrong, out of place. You might be too late."
So it wouldn't shock me. Honestly though, this entire cutscene perfectly encapsulates the entirety of Chief and Cortana's relationship. The emotion in just these few lines of dialogue is absolutely bang on. It also does an amazing job at illustrating just what the Gravemind did to her. Like, when Chief leaves her behind on High Charity at the end of Halo 2, she's resilient and almost ready to fight the Gravemind. And then when Chief rescues her, she almost just seems defeated. She's so depressive and low that it seems like she just gave in to the Gravemind, and I think that perfectly illustrates why the Flood's intelligence is easily their most dangerous trait. Their ability to so easily subvert AIs as powerful and intelligent as Cortana proves that absolutely nothing is off limits from being consumed by the Flood. Today, we are looking at a truly terrifying piece of Halo lore that combines the darkest side of both Oni and the Flood, and what happens when the outcome of this lethal concoction gets out of control. So, sometime after the Master Chief destroyed Alpha Halo, an Oni Prowler, the UNSC Red Horse, was sent on a top-secret mission to the destroyed remnants of the Ring. The Prowler was manned by Commander Tobias Foucault, Smart AI Rebecca, and a number of Marines, led by one Sergeant Lopez. When the crew arrived at the higher-than-top-secret coordinates, they stumbled upon a life pod containing the barely living mangled body of a prisoner, who revealed he'd come from the Mona Lisa, a freighter-turned-prison ship used for transporting prisoners across the galaxy. Spurting out blood in his dying breath, he revealed that he was happy that he was dying on board the Red Horse and not on the Mona Lisa, because it meant that he wouldn't come back. Following this ordeal, the commander's top-secret orders mysteriously updated to include assessing the status of the Mona Lisa, and if compromised beyond retrieval, destroy. and Lopez and her Marines were ordered to carry out the mission. From the moment they set foot in the Mona Lisa, things were already weird. They encountered a group of naked, unarmed elites who didn't attack, but instead just told the Marines to be quiet. One of the Marines then went missing, and Lopez ordered a few Marines to guard the Pelican while she searched for her. Lopez found the missing Marine having her chest stamped on by an elite, but upon closer inspection of the body, she found an odd growth inside of it, almost like a tentacle. During the inspection, what she believed to be more elites ran past her towards the Pelican, and when she radioed back to the squad there to warn them, they were attacked by whatever ran past her, and given their agonizing screams, it most definitely was not the Covenant. Burgundy, the pilot who'd stayed inside the Pelican, scanned the area on the ship's cams to find that all the Marines had vanished, leaving nothing but an assault rifle and empty casings, and the dead elite was being dragged away by something into the darkness. Something was clearly awry, and after radioing back to the Red Horse, their orders were now to initiate the call protocol and wipe the ship of any navigational data before destroying it. With these updated orders, the Marines split into two groups, one to carry out each objective, but as Lopez's group left, she realized that yet another Marine had mysteriously just gone missing. However, as her team made its way to erase the nav data, Lopez and the Marines would learn of a terrifying revelation. In the medical bay, they discovered a panic room sealed tightly shut. When they opened it, they found who they believed to be the ship's medical officer, Dr. John Smith. He said there'd been a prison break and that the prisoners had managed to take over the ship, but Lopez wasn't having it, considering they were yet to encounter a single human other than this mysterious doctor on board. Reluctantly, they took Smith with them to the bridge, but when they got there, they found yet another mangled human body, the room drenched with blood, but this time, the body had a weird mutated hand, almost rotten. To try and explain it, Smith came up with yet another story, this time saying that the Covenant prisoners they brought on board had a virus that they were testing that had managed to spread to humans. For the time being, Lopez bought it, until they encountered even more of the grotesque creatures, following which she demanded to know the truth. She ordered Mahmoud, one of her fellow Marines, to search Dr. Smith, and what he found made everything make perfect sense. He found Smith's ONI ID card, revealing that he was not a doctor, in fact a major working in research and development for ONI Section 3, the most secretive division of ONI, responsible for the Orion Project, Spartan 2 and Spartan 3 programs, Black Ops missions, and most importantly, for creating innovations using alien technology. This forced Major Smith into revealing the truth behind the Mona Lisa's orders, and behind what went down on the ship. What they were dealing with wasn't a virus, rather an infestation, known as the Flood. Hosts infected by the Flood don't register pain, and they don't require all body parts to function, and are seemingly only fueled by a primordial rage. He revealed that on the ship he was carrying out R&D for ONI, which would enable the UNSC to use the Covenant's supposed immunity to plasma radiation against them. But he also had intent to carry out tests on the Flood, and the Mona Lisa, a prison ship that harboured some of the worst criminals known to mankind, acted as the perfect testing bed. Major Smith had come on board the Mona Lisa and used his ONI authority to take command of it. He then ferried Covenant prisoners on board, and before even the prisoners or the crew of the ship knew what was going on, he made a slipspace jump to their current location, the highly classified coordinates of Alpha Halo. Assumingly, they then went down to the ring and gathered a test subject from it, an infected elite, which initially proved useful for Major Smith's studies, but only to an extent. Only wanted to find out how this infestation worked, how it spread, and only one host wasn't enough, hence the acquisition of a ship that was full of people who could disappear without anybody realizing. Prisoners then began to report cellmates being taken away by ONI agents and never returning. Under ONI directives, the human experimentation with the Flood had officially begun. Their goal was to find a way to weaponize it, turn hosts into mindless zombie soldiers to send into battle against the Covenant, the ultimate biological weapon. But clearly, somewhere down the line, it had all gone majorly wrong. It was believed that at some point, some of the elite prisoners had managed to break out of their cells and accidentally released a flood, causing an outbreak in which they consumed the crew and a large majority of prisoners on board. It was later believed that Major Smith had in fact exceeded his only orders, but knowing how secretive only Section 3 can be, this was likely just another instance of them covering up their tracks and planning to use Major Smith as a scapegoat in case any of this got out to the public. While the rest of the Marines continued to fulfill the Cole Protocol, Major Smith had managed to sneak away, find a life pod, and was on his way to the Red Horse, to safety. In doing so, he'd drawn the attention of a nearby Covenant capital ship, giving the Marines still on board the Mona Lisa 10 minutes to get to one of the 2 remaining life pods before the Red Horse launched a Shiva tactical nuke at the prison ship, destroying anything and everything on board. Ultimately, Major Smith would be court-martialed and tried for war crimes, and McCraw, one of the Marines, the rookie of the Marines, stole one of the remaining life pods, leaving only one left. This left the last 2 survivors aboard the Mona Lisa, Sergeant Lopez and Henry the Friendly Elite, to fight for the final pod, although their fate remains unknown. And that is the horrifying story of the Mona Lisa. In the end, the ship and all memory of it was obliterated by a Shiva nuke, but for the few who knew of it, nightmares of this repurposed prison ship will likely stay with them forever. Hey guys, welcome back. Today I want to dive into a few various pieces of Halo lore and look at exactly what it feels like to be infected by the Flood. The pain, the emotions, the mental distress, all of it. So sit back and get ready to experience what it truly feels like to become one with the Halo universe's most ominous enemy. So the first major aspect of Flood infection that's worth noting is that not only is it a physically torturous process, it's also extremely mentally torturous. Along with having your body twisted and broken to fit the Flood's needs, your memories are also harvested to further the Flood's intelligence. But more on that later. We're going to start off today with the physical pain caused by infection. So right off the bat, if you're infected by an infection form, the combination of its tendrils piercing your neck and spinal cord, and then you simultaneously trying to wrestle it off of you, must be excruciating, but this barely holds a light to the actual process of mutation. If you're unsuccessful at wrestling that little bastard off of you, then you're in for one painful experience. As the Flood supercell begins to be injected into your system, it converts your cells into Flood cells, which causes the rapid decomposition of your flesh, turning you from a healthy being into a walking pile of rotten flesh. As the Flood cells take over your body, they also begin to utilize your limbs for their own need. Now, contrary to popular belief, humans aren't just turned into combat forms. They can also be turned into carrier forms too, depending on the situation, and hell, they can even become hybrids of combat forms and carrier forms if the Flood need that to happen, but again, more on that later. When being converted into a combat form, the host goes through an extremely painful transition, where their bones are snapped, skin torn, and arteries burst to create that iconic Flood whip. Much like a certain alien from another sci-fi franchise, the infection form burrows itself into the host's chest, and organs are moved and or broken down to make space for it. The neck is also usually snapped to fit the infection form, which leaves the head dangling down the victim's torso. Along with the internal organs, all other forms of biomass digested by the Flood cells are repurposed, mostly as the mounds of sort of rotten flesh that you can see growing off the combat form, but also sometimes for things like the Flood whip, which are maybe longer than the limb that they replaced. For victims to be instead turned into carrier forms, their bodies have to be too frail, weak, or damaged to become a combat form, and a disturbing transformation occurs that we don't know too much about, but from what we can see, comparing the size and shape of a human body to a carrier form, you can imagine that maybe the torso or the upper body expands out and all the internal organs get repurposed to make space for the incubation of infection forms. It's just a really disturbing process that I'm actually kind of happy we don't know the details of. For that sort of hybrid combat carrier form that I touched on earlier, a sac that incubates the infection forms grows on the victim's back, and it can explode at will like a regular carrier form, but without killing the combat form, allowing it to continue carrying out behaviours typical of the form, which really does make it an absolute bastard to fight. The worst thing about all of this is that most of it usually happens when the victim is still alive and conscious. In fact, the infection form quite literally keeps the host alive during this excruciating procedure by chemically isolating the host's dying brain, preventing it from contacting the other parts of the body to inform them that the host is dead. This has a specific use that we're going to touch on later. However, this process of infection doesn't always go as planned. Infection forms aren't robots. Sometimes they fail their job due to various factors. In the unfortunate case of Private Wallace Jenkins, the infection form that converted him was incredibly old and partially failed its job in the most agonizing way. Jenkins was fully converted into a combat form, but he never died, and even as a combat form, he retained partial control over his body. Whenever the infection form was injured, he was able to control himself and, to a degree, communicate with other humans, but the rest of the time, all he could do was just sit back and watch as this foreign parasite controlled his body. During the brief periods of control that he got, he tried to kill himself, but whenever he got close to it, the infection form would regain control and keep him in this disturbing state of limbo. This terrifying instance of infection feeds into the second form of torture that a victim undergoes when being infected by the Flood, the mental torture. As well as inflicting severe physical pain, the mental state of the host is also attacked. We've already touched on how the parasite subverts the death signals emitted by the brain to the rest of the body to keep the host alive during infection, but it goes far, far deeper than that. During the painful process of mutation, the parasite also sifts through the host's memories, searching for any knowledge that could help buff the Flood and help them expand. Information and knowledge are as important to the Flood's growth as biomass, and this can sometimes lead to hosts not being used as combat forms or carrier forms, but instead being entirely merged with a proto-gravemind to provide it with raw, expansive knowledge that it needs to expand and ultimately become a fully fledged sentient gravemind. This happened in the terrifying case of Captain Keyes. When searching through the memories of their victims, the Flood are able to identify those with a wealth of knowledge or with a specific type of knowledge that they require, and then give them sort of special treatment when choosing what to do with them. Because of Keyes' unique role within the UNSC and his extensive knowledge of spacecraft and alien tech, he became part of the proto-gravemind, so the Flood could attempt to extract the knowledge required to pilot Covenant ships, with the ultimate goal of commandeering the Truth and Reconciliation to escape the ring and infect the galaxy. They violated Keyes' mind, invading his most private memories and tried to make him forget those of his daughter, Miranda, and his lover, Halsey, two things he held incredibly dear, offering a dark reminder that he'd never see them again. He did, however, put up an extremely strong fight against the invading parasite, and for the longest time managed to withhold information from it in a mental battle, utilizing what remained of his fortitude. He repetitively fed the Flood unimportant information like his name, date of birth, and service number to stop them from finding Earth through his memories, or the knowledge to pilot a Covenant cruiser, all while being distressingly violated, both psychologically and physically. Eventually, however, Keyes ran out of energy and succumbed to the parasite, and was killed by Chief when he retrieved his neural implant. What happened to Keyes, both mentally and physically, accurately portrays the terrifying reality of Flood infection. It's not just like any old zombie virus where the victim gets infected, falls sick, and then turns. It can be a shorter, yet far more excruciating process of snapping limbs, tearing skin, and bursting arteries. Or it can be a far longer process of extreme physical and psychological torture, where you're teased with the things that you hold most dear in life, before having them torn away with the most dire of consequences. In this video, I want to talk about the hypothetical situation in which the Flood are victorious and manage to infect or consume almost every living being in the galaxy. What happens to the Flood after? What happens if they infect other galaxies? Today, I'm going to do my best to answer all of these questions based on what we know. Also, make sure you stick around to the end of the video for just a sort of personal thank you from me for such a damn good year. Okay, so let's start off by looking at how the Flood spread, because this may actually hold the key to understanding what happens if they win. As the Flood outbreak spreads, as well as infecting living creatures, it also collects their biomass to assemble a Gravemind. The further the Flood spreads, the more biomass, and also consequently intelligence, is fed to the Gravemind, which allows it and also the Flood outbreak to evolve through a series of 4 stages. The first 3 stages, the Feral, the Coordinated, and also the Interstellar stages, are the only ones that we've seen in the games. Now, to understand the Flood, let me just give you guys a very quick rundown on these stages. So, the first one, the Feral stage, occurred during Combat Evolved, and it covers the initial outbreak and the formation of a Proto-Gravemind. It then moves on to the second stage, the Coordinated stage, which occurred during Halo 2 and begins roughly around the time that a Proto-Gravemind acquires enough biomass and also intelligence to evolve into a Gravemind. This stage of evolution allows the Flood to create hives, which release large amounts of spores into the air, which essentially turns the Flood infection airborne. And then the third stage is the Interstellar stage, the stage in which the Flood gain access to interstellar travel. This occurred towards the end of Halo 3, and if the Flood ever happened to get to this stage, then it means a galactic apocalypse is dangerously close. Not only can they now travel between star systems, but they're also capable of using the Logic Plague, the informational version of the Flood infection to infect non-biological entities. They can also spread this plague over data networks as well, which technically could make the use of radios and network-based communication methods extremely dangerous for humans, and also for AIs too. And then we have the fourth stage, so significant and galaxy-shattering that it's only ever really been hypothesized about. This is the transgalactic stage, a stage that can only occur once an entire galaxy has been consumed. What happens is, essentially all of the separate Flood outbreaks across the galaxy sort of sweep through all of the planets in said galaxy until they reach its center, which helps them ensure that no planet has gone uninfected, and when they reach the center, all of these outbreaks sort of coalesce and merge together to become one ultra-sized, hyper-intelligent outbreak. At this point, about 99.99999% recurring of all living species in the galaxy have been infected by the Flood, and the galaxy-wide parasitic apocalypse is in full effect. The Flood have officially won. So, what happens next? Well, it depends on the state of other galaxies and also, in the long term, the state of the universe. If this galaxy, let's just use the Milky Way galaxy for example, that's been entirely infected is the only galaxy to be entirely infected, then the Flood can then begin to spread to other galaxies to continue to consume and grow, hence the name transgalactic. In the Milky Way, they've essentially reached their critical mass. There's no more biomass or information to be consumed that could help them expand. They have to move elsewhere to do so. Now, it's been hypothesized that this happened prior to the Foreigner-Flood War. The precursor to this universe-altering conflict was the Human-Foreigner War, a war that was sparked by a major misunderstanding. For no visible reason to them, the ancient humans had suddenly begun invading Foreigner-controlled space at an aggressive pace. Of course, the Foreigners weren't having any of it, and they took this opportunity to flex the mantle that they believed they so rightly deserved, and they put the humans in their place by essentially wiping them out. However, it later turned out that the humans hadn't been invading, they'd been running from the Flood. The parasite was spreading at an alarming rate through human-controlled space, and they were fleeing to safety to survive. However, as a possible contingency plan, human scientists had genetically altered a third of their population, believing these gene modifications would destroy the Flood biomass and essentially defeat them. When they sacrificed these test subjects to the Flood actually began to retreat before eventually vanishing entirely. They believed that they'd beaten the Flood. Or so they thought. 10,000 years later, the Flood reappeared in Foreigner space, stronger and bigger than ever before, and thus it was believed that when they were defeated, they in fact purposely retreated to both create a false sense of security, and also to gather the strength and intelligence of other galaxies before one final assault on the Foreigners. And the rest is very violent, bloody history. But what happens to the galaxies that the Flood depart? Well, the infection definitely doesn't just fade away. I imagine that most, if not all, of the key mines will remain there, attached to the planets they've been grown on. It's also safe to assume that Flood hives continue to fill the atmosphere with spores, ensuring that the air on all of the planets in said galaxy remains unbreathable, and that any attempt from the few survivors out there to cleanse the parasite is thwarted. I imagine as well that some combat forms and pure forms likely stick around too for similar reasons, but the main body of the outbreak and the Force will depart on Flood-controlled ships. Computer systems, AIs, and data networks will also remain compromised too, thanks to the key mines, so all in all, this parasite ain't going nowhere. Well, despite actually going somewhere. Okay, but what if the Milky Way is the last galaxy to be infected? What if literally every single other galaxy in existence has already fallen to the parasite? Well, then based on what we already know about their stages of evolution, we can hypothesize that they'd try and reach a 5th stage, where they'd attempt to travel to other universes. That said though, to do that, it'd require the species in one of the galaxies they infected to have had sufficient knowledge to do so. Because all of the Flood's intelligence comes from the species they consume, if no species had gotten that far yet technologically, then we can assume that the Flood almost hit an evolutionary dead end and are trapped in this universe. The only way that I could see them finding the intelligence to escape is if maybe a species from another universe enters ours and is then infected by the Flood. But the chance of that happening is like so low that it's really not worth considering, in my opinion at least. Because this is so unlikely to occur, it's likely that the Flood will just continue to exist as is. As far as we know, combat forms and the like don't exactly go dormant, like, for example, the zombies at the end of 28 Days Later, because they aren't even remotely human anymore. They don't require nutrients or nourishment to survive. The same goes for grave mines and key mines and everything in between too. The universe would realistically just remain a massive parasitic death trap to any species unfortunate enough to stumble upon it. Today I want to talk about how the Gravemind killed Chief in Halo 3. Yes, you heard right, killed. Notice the air quotes. Now this is something that I never really noticed until recently thanks to Halo Canon. And it's going to allow me to talk about another aspect of Halo 3 that I've never really found the right time to discuss before. So really, today, we are killing 2 infection forms with 1 stone. Speaking of infection forms, the other day I got a pretty nasty Flood-like virus, so if my voice sounds kind of weird today, then that's my excuse. So let's cut to the chase and address that glaringly clickbait title. If you haven't worked out by now that I don't mean killed in the conventional sense, then now you know. What I'm talking about relates to easily the most annoying element of Halo 3, the Gravemind and Cortana moments, which grind you to a painful halt and are unable to be stopped, avoided, or even disabled. These incoming transmissions from the Gravemind are how he killed Chief. Now oddly, whenever Chief received one of these messages, all of his vital signs flattened and he was marked as killed in action. Now, if you're wondering how we know this, then just listen to what this medic marine has to say during the first moment of the game.
Sir, you okay?
Your vitals just pinged KIA.
But the interesting question is how? Well, I'm afraid the answer to that question is a little bit of a cop-out, but it's all that we've got, and it relates specifically to the way in which the Gravemind transmits these messages to Chief. Because the Flood are precursor in origin, when they reach a certain stage of evolution and become intelligent enough, they're able to utilize ancient precursor ideas. Because they were the creators of all life in the galaxy, the precursors were infinitely, and I mean infinitely more intelligent than any other species in existence, and thus their sort of philosophical ideas and concepts are far beyond human comprehension. During Halo 3, the Gravemind uses one of these concepts to contact Chief, arguably the most central of all of their concepts, neural physics, and this is sort of where the cop-out comes in. Neural physics are essentially the concept that everything in existence is a living entity, but in a way that sort of transcends the typical human understanding of living. Precursors were intelligent enough to harness these principles and use them to their advantage, creating entities such as star roads, allowing them to travel the universe, but that's an entirely different topic for an entirely different day. So, using this idea that everything is a living being, the Gravemind utilized the Precursor's ability to harness this scientific philosophical concept to speak to Chief. Or, if you want to boil it down into layman's terms, the Gravemind used telepathy. During the original trilogy, Bungie used a lot of poetic license to make their games and their stories more interesting. One of their most iconic philosophies when developing games was the rule of cool, the idea that if something didn't exactly fit or contradicted pre-established lore, but at the same time made for a really cool experience, then they'd include it anyway, ignoring the fact that it didn't exactly fit with the canon. However, when 343 took over, they began trying to patch these inconsistencies up with new lore that explained them, and thus, neural physics, as introduced in the Forerunner trilogy, ended up being how they tried to patch up most of the Flood's inconsistencies. Not only did this new lore give an actual explanation for the Cortana and Gravemind moments beyond telepathy, but it also helped explain how the Gravemind managed to get High Charity to the Ark without having to use the one portal at Void that literally everybody else had to use. For those wondering, it literally just used neural physics to create a portal above Mars that led directly to the Ark. It's honestly that simple. However, there are still two oddities created by these moments that we still need to address. The first is, did Chief's vitals really drop to KIA levels, or were the medic sensors just bugged out by the very fabric of existence being bent by the Gravemind? Well, again, we don't know for sure, but we can make an assumption based on what little we do know. When Chief's contacted, his movement is drastically slowed down. Given that his pulse, breathing rate and blood pressure are supposedly flatlined, this would actually make sense. At least kind of. His muscles wouldn't be getting the oxygen that they need to keep functioning correctly, and thus they'd be massively fatigued, and therefore his movement would be slowed. The reason that he's not completely immobile and can still somewhat move, however, is due to how his Mjolnir armor works. Instead of interfacing with his muscles, it interfaces with him neurally, so as long as his brain is still active and alive, the armor can still move, and thus he can still move. So we don't know for sure if his vitals really were at dead levels, but it wasn't totally out of the question. The second oddity relates specifically to the messages from Cortana. She says some really obscure stuff to Chief, and yet she never makes him aware of the impending Flood invasion of Earth that the Gravemind's planning. That seems kind of badly written, right? Well, fear not. There's a reason for this. On High Charity, the Gravemind had essentially managed to hack into Cortana's systems, and was able to manipulate her and convey whatever message it wanted through her voice. The point of doing this was quite sinister. It was to convince Chief, and also Cortana, that she was descending into rampancy, and that she was becoming yet another pawn of the Flood. This explains why one of Cortana's moments has her saying, "I am a monument to all your sins." It was essentially the Gravemind waging psychological warfare on Chief, while also luring Cortana into believing that she was descending into rampancy. Although technically she kind of was.